Angel Lynn was born in 2001 into a family from Leicestershire. Her relatives remembered her as an energetic and cheerful girl who always wanted to be the center of attention, loved fun company, and easily found common ground with people. She spent her childhood surrounded by loved ones, and her family always played a key role in her life. She was a beloved daughter and sister, and this was evident in every detail of her daily life. At school, Angel showed good academic ability, excelling in the humanities. She strove for independence and wanted to prove that she could achieve a lot. After graduating from high school, she planned to go to college to continue her education, but her interests were not limited to just studying. She was drawn to an active lifestyle. She loved spending time with friends, playing sports, and enjoying the outdoors. Angel was fond of quad biking and water sports, in particular jet skiing. Despite her active lifestyle, she remained a girly girl. As her loved ones described her, she loved fashion, cosmetics, took care of herself, and paid attention to her appearance. At the same time, she combined gentleness with determination. She dreamed of a normal, happy life with a job, a family, and her own path. At one stage of her adolescence, Angel took on a part-time job, combining study and work, which gave her more confidence in her own abilities. It was during this period that she met Che Bauskill. The young people began to communicate, and soon a romantic relationship developed between them. As is often the case in youth, emotions played a significant role, and Angel completely immersed herself in this new stage of her life. The first months of the relationship seemed bright: walks, meetings, joint plans. But over time, alarming signs began to appear in Che's behavior. His jealousy and desire to control her became increasingly apparent. He checked on her more and more often, interfering in her social circle, and his quick temper led to arguments and conflicts. Despite her inner strength, Angel was too young and inexperienced to immediately recognize the threat in these signs. She continued the relationship, hoping that everything could be changed and believed that love could smooth out the rough edges. However, those around her had already noticed the changes. Family and friends said that she had become more withdrawn, went out less often, and increasingly adapted to her boyfriend's mood. Angel had reached a point in her life where her inner world was at odds with the lifestyle she was used to. On the one hand, she had dreams, plans, and the support of her family. But on the other, she had a complicated and tense relationship that was gradually taking over everything else. As Che tightened his control, she lost her freedom of choice. This was a warning sign for her family, but they could not foresee the consequences of how events would unfold. In September 2020, their relationship reached a critical point. Another argument became a turning point. Angel tried to leave, to defend her right to independence and distance herself from Che. But it was this decision that proved fatal. It was a normal morning for the residents of Leicestershire. Traffic was heavy on the A6 highway near Loughborough, with people rushing to work. Suddenly, passers-by noticed the motionless body of a young woman on the side of the road. She was lying unconscious, and witnesses immediately called an ambulance. When the doctors arrived, it became clear that the situation was critical. The girl had suffered severe head injuries. The fight for her life began right there on the spot, after which she was taken to the hospital. The car she had fallen out of was no longer nearby. Witnesses could not say exactly what had happened, but the scene looked frightening. The police quickly launched an investigation. The identity of the victim was quickly established. She was 19-year-old Angel Lynn. Her condition remained extremely serious, and doctors said her life was at risk. From the very beginning, it was clear to investigators that they would have to determine whether this incident was a tragic accident or a crime. The facts gathered at the scene did not allow for a clear conclusion. The circumstances indicated that Angel had fallen or been thrown from a moving car. How exactly this happened remained a mystery, but in the first hours after the incident, investigators realized that the key to solving the case lay in what had happened in the girl's life the day before, and at the very moment she ended up on the busy highway. These questions became the starting point for an investigation that would soon reveal the frightening details of Angel Lynn's last days and hours before the tragedy. It was particularly important for police analysts to understand the psychology of the crime. If the girl had indeed been pushed into the van, then the kidnappers had a motive and a specific plan of action. But why was she thrown out or fell out of the car? What happened inside the vehicle while it was moving? These questions remained unanswered, which is why the investigation required caution and thoroughness. At this stage, one thing was clear. The crime was not committed by random passers-by. It was a planned act related to personal relationships or conflicts. Angel Lin was not the victim of an accident, but of deliberate actions for the police. This meant that they had to work to establish connections, identify those involved, and secure evidence. The events of that day forever changed the fate of the girl and her family. But for the investigators, this was only the first step. They already understood that what they had witnessed was a kidnapping that had ended in catastrophic consequences. The main question remained: who were these people, and where did they disappear to after taking Angel Lin away in a silver Ford Transit in front of witnesses? When the initial evidence pointed to kidnapping, investigators began to examine Angel Lin's immediate circle. In cases like this, personal connections are often the key to solving the mystery. The police began to study the girl's social contacts, her daily routes, and her relationships with those who could have been nearby on the day of the incident. It soon became clear that her relationship with Che Baoskil had been at the center of her life in recent years. Their relationship was not easy. To an outside observer, they looked like a typical young couple, but underneath the surface there were many conflicts. According to friends, they often argued, accompanied by outbursts of jealousy and mutual distrust. At one point, Angel tried to save the relationship, believing that they would change, but those around her increasingly noticed signs of control and pressure. This became an important line of inquiry for the investigation. If the girl wanted to leave the relationship and her partner did not want to let her go, the motive for the kidnapping became more obvious. However, strong evidence was needed. The police understood that conclusions about Che Baoskil's possible involvement had to be based not only on emotional testimony, but also on concrete facts. The work with CCTV cameras continued and became increasingly detailed. Experts reviewed hundreds of hours of footage, comparing images of the suspicious van with the database of vehicles registered in the region. Each match was carefully checked to rule out random or unsuitable vehicles. After a long filtering process, several vehicles were identified that matched the description and time of passage along the route. One of these vehicles immediately attracted special attention, as it had previously been of interest to the police. It turned out that this van was linked to Che Baoskil's associates, which immediately heightened suspicions. By comparing the vehicle's route with the exact time Angel Lin was on the A6 highway, investigators obtained the first direct match linking the vehicle to the scene of the tragedy. In parallel with the technical analysis, the questioning of witnesses continued. One of the local residents testified that a few hours before the incident, he saw a girl resembling Angel on one of the streets of Rothley. According to him, there was a young man nearby who was clearly trying to hold her back, while the girl was trying to break free. The description of this man resembled Che Baoskil. The situation developed rapidly. A silver Ford Transit drove up to the couple, the door opened, and the girl was forcibly pushed inside. The witness noted that it looked as if it had been planned and coordinated in advance. This account completely matched what had already been seen on the video recordings and added a new degree of credibility to the investigation. Now the police had an increasingly clear picture in which there was less and less room for coincidence. These words matched the CCTV footage, but there was still no official identification for the police. This became the starting point for building a theory. Perhaps Angel's ex-boyfriend and his friend, the van driver, were behind the kidnapping. But without confirmed evidence, it was impossible to press charges. The investigation also examined telephone data. The timestamps of signals registered in the Rothley and Loughborough areas made it possible to trace the route of some numbers. One of them matched the device used by Che Baoskil. This data was not conclusive evidence, but it significantly strengthened the suspicions. After doctors took Angel Lin to the hospital, an investigative team arrived at the scene. The police had the task of reconstructing the events on the A6 highway. In such cases, time is of the essence. The faster the evidence is collected, the higher the probability of reconstructing the chain of events and determining what actually happened. The first step was to examine the roadside and the roadway. Traces of an emergency fall were visible on the asphalt. The impact with the road was so strong that some of Angel's clothing was damaged, and there were marks on the surface indicating that the fall had occurred from a moving car. Investigators immediately noted that the situation did not resemble a simple loss of balance or an accident. The injuries and the nature of their occurrence were too serious. While checking out the scene, the police started gathering witness statements. A few drivers and passers-by said they saw a silver Ford Transit van on the road not long before the girl was found. Some of them noticed that the car was going pretty fast and there was a young driver in the front seat. However, what was most alarming were the words of eyewitnesses who said they saw the girl being forced into the van. These statements immediately changed the nature of the investigation. A key element was the review of CCTV footage. A CCTV system was in operation on the highway and in the vicinity of Rothley, recording the flow of traffic. Experts analyzed the footage taken a few minutes before the tragedy. The screen clearly showed a silver Ford Transit moving towards the place where Angel Lynn was later found. Further footage from another angle showed a young man near a residential street forcibly holding a girl and literally pushing her into the van. This scene was a turning point in understanding the whole situation. The investigators no longer had any doubts. This was not an accident but a kidnapping. The events took on a completely different scale. Now the police were investigating not only the fact that she had fallen from a car, but also the violent restraint of the girl against her will. Their task was to establish the identities of those who were in the van and to determine where they had gone after the incident. The investigators' work was complicated by the fact that little time had passed and the criminals could have already left the area. However, CCTV recorded the vehicle's movement along the route from Rothley to Loughborough. By comparing the time of the recording with the moment Angel was found on the road, the police obtained an approximate time frame during which she fell or was thrown out of the van. This helped to establish the speed of the vehicle, about 60 miles per hour. The understanding that the girl had fallen out of a moving van at such a speed explained the nature of her injuries. From that point on, the police's work became systematic. All silver Ford Transits registered in the county were checked. Recent vehicle movements were analyzed, and owners and drivers with connections to Angel Lynn were identified. The investigation gradually narrowed the search. At this time, doctors continued to fight for the girl's life. Her condition remained critical, and she was connected to life support. Her family was at the hospital waiting for news, but at the same time, investigators began visiting the house, trying to understand whether Angel had any conflicts who might wish her harm, and under what circumstances she ended up in the van soon. New evidence came to light. One of the local residents told the police that he had seen an argument on the street between a young man and a girl who matched Angel's description. The man tried to hold her back, after which a second person, the driver of the van, intervened. The girl was pushed inside, and the car suddenly drove off. These words completely coincided with what was recorded on the cameras. Thus, the puzzle began to come together. It became clear that the crime was premeditated. Angel Lynn did not fall accidentally and did not end up on the road due to her own carelessness. She was kidnapped, and her fall was the result of the actions of those in the car. However, at that point, the identities of the kidnappers had not yet been officially established. The police only had camera recordings and eyewitness accounts. The task was to compare this material with Angel's circle of acquaintances. It was known that she was dating a young man named Che Bauskill, and their relationship was complicated. But at that point, it was only a hypothesis, and the investigation was in no hurry to press charges. Meanwhile, doctors continued to fight for Angel's life. Her family was by her side, knowing that her fate now depended not only on medicine, but also on whether the investigation would succeed in establishing the truth. Public interest in the case grew. The first reports began to appear in the news that a mysterious incident involving a young woman had occurred on the A6 highway. But so far, the police had not named any suspects, limiting themselves to general statements. The investigation followed a clear logic, which step by step pieced together the whole picture of the incident. Surveillance cameras recorded the moment of the abduction. The footage clearly showed that Angel Lin was resisting and did not want to get into the car voluntarily. Witnesses confirmed that they saw the girl being pushed into a silver van, and her resistance was obvious. The route of the car coincided with the time frame of the tragedy, and it was this fact that made it possible to compare the time of Angel's fall onto the road with the movement of a specific vehicle. Soon, the police received information about a possible connection between the van and Che Bauskil's associates, which made the suspicions against him more substantial and guided the course of the investigation. However, this was not enough for official charges. In kidnapping cases, the slightest mistake or unproven fact could result in failure in court and cast doubt on the entire case. The suspects could deny their involvement, claim that Angel got into the car herself, or even that the fall onto the road was an accident. Therefore, the investigation needed to gather an impenetrable body of evidence in which every piece of evidence was verified and legally established. Only then could it be expected that these facts would not be challenged in court and would lead to a conviction. Investigators understood that one of the possible participants was Che's friend Rocco Sansom. His name appeared in the suspect's circle and in police databases. Checking the connections between him and the Ford Transit van gave additional grounds for suspicion. But here too, the investigation had to proceed cautiously without rushing to conclusions. The initial suspicion stage was important because it was at this point that the investigation began to form a general picture. By now, no one doubted that the crime was related to Angel's personal relationships. The main theory was that her ex-boyfriend, unable to accept her decision to leave him, had participated in the kidnapping with a friend. However, there were still a few steps left before final confirmation. For the girl's family, this stage was a time of agonizing uncertainty. They knew about Angel's complicated relationship with Che, but hoped that the investigation would be able to finally confirm or refute these suspicions. Every new piece of news about the progress of the case was received with anxiety and hope. Within the police, there was a growing understanding that the crime was not random. It was the culmination of a conflict that had been developing for months. Angel Lin found herself at the center of a situation where personal relationships had become a source of danger. For investigators, this meant that the work ahead would involve gathering irrefutable evidence and confirming a version of events that had so far existed only as a hypothesis. This marked the end of the initial suspicion phase. The evidence already pointed to certain individuals, but no official charges had been filed yet. The investigation was at a point where the picture was almost complete. But the last piece of the puzzle still had to be put in place, and it was this piece that would take the case from the stage of conjecture to the stage of direct accusations. The key breakthrough in the Angel Lin case came when police experts completed a detailed analysis of CCTV footage. In the early stages of the investigation, investigators had only fragmentary eyewitness accounts and testimony about a silver Ford Transit, but they lacked irrefutable evidence. After comparing data from different cameras, they were able to reconstruct the exact sequence of events. Footage taken in Rothley showed Angel walking down the street. A young man runs up to her, holds her back, and prevents her from leaving. A moment later, a van stops nearby. The rear door opens, and the girl is forced inside. The car drives away, picking up speed. This episode became a turning point in the entire investigation. Forensic laboratory staff enlarged the image and identified the person. The comparison showed a match with Che Bauskil. Further footage revealed that Rocco Sansom, a friend of Bauskil's, was behind the wheel. Thus, it was CCTV that became the main evidence supporting the theory that Angel Lin was the victim of a kidnapping. But the evidence did not stop there. Investigators collected statements from several eyewitnesses who confirmed that they had seen the girl being dragged into a silver van. Independent witnesses described the incident in the same way. Angel resisted, and the men acted roughly and decisively. These words completely coincided with the video footage, which made them particularly valuable to the investigation. The next step was to study the vehicle's route. Traffic cameras recorded the same Ford Transit traveling along the A6 highway towards Loughborough. The timestamps coincided with the moment Angel was found on the road. This confirmed that this particular vehicle was at the scene of the tragedy at the right time. Experts also calculated the speed of the vehicle, about 60 miles per h, which explained the severity of the injuries sustained by the girl who fell out of the car. Mobile phone data provided additional evidence. Analysis of mobile phone tower signals showed that the phones registered to Che Bauskill and Rocco Sansom were in the same areas at the same time as the van. This data reinforced the technological part of the investigation, ruling out the possibility of a coincidence. Thus, the police had a whole set of evidence at their disposal. The first was CCTV footage showing the moment of the abduction. The second was witness testimony confirming that the girl had been forced into the car. The third was footage from the A6 highway showing the movement of the very van from which Angel had fallen. The fourth piece of evidence was phone data that clearly linked Bauskill and Sansom to the root of the crime. Together they formed an unbreakable chain of evidence. After that, the police obtained an arrest warrant. On the 17th of January 2021, the arrests were made. The officers first arrived at the house where Che Bauskill was staying. The arrest took place without the use of force. He did not resist, but denied his involvement, claiming that Angel was allegedly there voluntarily. He was taken to the police station for questioning. A few hours later, Rocco Sansom was also arrested. He also did not try to escape, but in his testimony, he tried to minimize his own role, claiming that he was just driving the car and had nothing to do with the kidnapping. These explanations were irrelevant to the investigators because they already had the key evidence in their hands. Camera footage showed that the actions of both participants were coordinated. One held and pushed the girl into the car, while the other provided transportation and immediately drove the car away from the scene. The investigators had no doubt that this was a joint action and that the entire group should be held responsible. After the arrest, the stage of consolidating the case materials began. Investigators carefully checked the testimonies, comparing them with video recordings and telephone data. Additional examinations were conducted to confirm the time, speed of the van, and the nature of Angel's injuries. All this allowed the prosecution to build a strong case for the upcoming trial. In the final stage of the investigation, the case took on an official form. The indictment included kidnapping, controlling behavior, and obstruction of justice for Che Bauskill, as well as kidnapping for Rocco Sansom. Preparing the case for trial involved compiling all the materials into a single chronology, forming a list of witnesses, and preparing expert reports. Now the police and prosecutors had a complete set of evidence to present the case in court. After the investigation was completed, and Che Bauskill and Rocco Sansom were arrested, the case went to Leicester Crown Court. Many people were waiting for this trial: journalists, the public, and, above all, Angel Lin's family. The story of the kidnapping and its tragic consequences had caused a widespread reaction, so every hearing attracted attention. The trial began in January 2022. The prosecution presented the evidence gathered over many months. The main evidence was CCTV footage showing the moment of the abduction. These images were played in the courtroom. They clearly show Angel Lin walking down the street and Che Bauskill catching up with her, grabbing her and holding her down despite her resistance. A few seconds later, a silver Ford Transit appears nearby. The door of the van opens and the girl is forced inside. The driver, Rocco Sansom, immediately accelerates and the car drives away. The recordings became the central evidence for the prosecution. Prosecutors argued that this was not just an accident or a mistake, but a planned and coordinated action by two people. One organized the physical abduction, while the other provided transportation. The court was also shown subsequent footage from the A6 highway, which captured the same van traveling in the direction of Loughborough. A few minutes later, Angel was found on the side of the road with severe injuries. The prosecution supplemented the video evidence with witness testimony. Witnesses called to the court confidently stated that they saw the girl being forcibly pushed into the car. Their words coincided with the CCTV footage. Independent individuals who were not involved in the events confirmed that Angel's actions were resistance, not voluntary consent. Mobile phone data also became an important element of the prosecution's case. Experts presented reports showing that Che Bauskill and Rocco Sansom's devices were traveling along the Rothley, Loughborough route at the same time as the key events took place. The geolocation matched the locations recorded on video. Thus, digital traces supplemented the visual evidence. The defense attempted to challenge the charges. The lawyers claimed that Angel allegedly fell out of the car herself, and that the defendants did not intend to harm her. They emphasized that the defendants were not charged with causing bodily harm, but only with kidnapping, and tried to downplay their role. Regarding Rocco Sansom, the defense claimed that he was only driving the car and did not actively participate in the violent actions. However, the body of evidence was too strong. The prosecution emphasized that the girl's fall from the car was a direct result of the kidnapping. Even if the defendants did not plan to injure her, it was their coordinated actions that led to Angel Lin ending up on the highway in critical condition. The court hearings lasted several weeks. Each side had the opportunity to present its arguments. Representatives of Angel's family were present in the courtroom. The trial was a difficult ordeal for them. They had to watch video recordings of the kidnapping and hear medical reports about their daughter's injuries. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. The prosecutors showed step by step how the evidence formed a continuous chain. The defense tried to find weak points, but the video recordings and technical data made the prosecution's case strong. When the moment came to deliver the verdict, the court withdrew for deliberation. The entire courtroom awaited the decision that would put an end to the case. On the 26th of January 2022, Leicester Crown Court found Che Bauskill guilty of kidnapping, controlling and coercive behavior, and interfering with the administration of justice. On the same day, he was sentenced to 7.5 years in prison. On the 26th of January 2022, Leicester Crown Court found Rocco Sansom guilty of kidnapping. On the same day, he was sentenced to 21 months in prison. On the 23rd of March 2022, the Court of Appeal reviewed Che Bauskill's sentence. The judges considered the original sentence to be excessively lenient and increased his prison term to 12 years. Anastasia Kamlovskaya, known online as Anastasia Grishman, was born on February 12, 1996 in St. Petersburg. From an early age, Anastasia showed an interest in art and self-development. Her family was characterized by an atmosphere of mutual support and respect for the individuality of each family member. Her parents, despite their different professions, always supported her desire for self-determination and developed her creative abilities. Anastasia grew up in a stable family. Her father was an engineer and her mother was an elementary school teacher. Her parents paid great attention to their daughter's upbringing, instilling in her a love of learning and culture. From childhood, Anastasia was quite independent and enjoyed being creative and doing things that inspired her. She began drawing at an early age, which led her to attend art school. At school, Anastasia excelled academically and was sociable, but she always remained somewhat reserved and disliked large gatherings, preferring small groups. After graduating from high school, Anastasia enrolled at St. Petersburg State University's Faculty of Arts and Design, where she discovered her passion for creativity and experimentation in various forms of self-expression. However, despite her academic success, she decided not to pursue an academic career, choosing instead to immerse herself in the world of fashion and social media. This decision was a turning point in her life. Anastasia realized that her future lay in the creative industry, and she sought to find ways to express herself that would be directly linked to her personality. For several years, she worked as a model for various photo shoots and developed her blog, posting photos and reviewing fashion trends. She soon attracted the attention of major brands and began working with renowned photographers. At some point, Anastasia realized that her place was not just in photo shoots, but in creating content that would be interesting to her audience. She then began actively working on adult platforms such as OnlyFans, where she could fully reveal her personality and express herself through candid photos and videos. Anastasia also started a popular TikTok account, where she posted videos about her daily life, creating an image of an independent and confident girl. Soon her content began to attract more and more followers, and she gained immense popularity among her fans. This success on social media not only became her main source of income, but also opened up new horizons for her career growth. Her life was filled with exciting events, travels, and meeting interesting people. She did not limit herself to modeling, but also began to master the role of a tattoo artist, creating unique works for her clients. Tattoos became another important part of her life, and she proudly displayed her work on Instagram and other platforms. Anastasia was passionate about her work and worked hard to build a successful career in the world of fashion and art. However, despite her professional success, her personal life was less stable. Her relationship with Dmitry Chernyshov, her boyfriend, was increasingly fraught with tension, jealousy, and misunderstanding. Although Dmitry also worked in the adult industry and participated in the filming of erotic videos, his attitude toward Anastasia's success and popularity on social media remained complicated and contradictory. They met through mutual friends in the fashion industry and began dating when Anastasia was just starting to develop her career in the adult industry. Dmitry was attractive and charismatic, and their relationship began as a romantic story of mutual admiration and passion. He was very supportive of her endeavors and became her partner both in life and in her professional life, appearing on set with her. However, over time, their relationship became increasingly strained. Dmitry's jealousy of Anastasia's success and popularity on the internet began to grow stronger. This caused many conflicts between them, despite their outward harmony. Anastasia, despite constant problems in her personal life, continued to work and build her career, but her relationship with Dmitry became increasingly toxic and problematic. On August 2, 2022, Anastasia Kamlevskaya, a popular model and blogger known on OnlyFans and TikTok, went missing. She last communicated with her loved ones and friends, but soon stopped responding to messages. This date became fateful for her loved ones and friends, who could not imagine that their dear friend and colleague would disappear without a trace. In the first few days, her friend tried to call her but received no answer. She decided to take a step that shocked everyone even more. On August 3, 2022, after several unsuccessful attempts to contact Anastasia, her friend, filled with anxiety, turned to the police. The investigation into her disappearance began only a few days later, when they came to the conclusion that the girl had indeed disappeared and her life could be in danger. On August 10, 2022, after several days of searching and concern from friends and relatives, police officers arrived at Anastasia Kamlevskaya's apartment, located on Yuzhny Highway in St. Petersburg. The apartment door was opened after a friend who had been unable to contact the girl since August 2 called the police. Concerned about her disappearance, the friend decided to report it to the police, and a few days later, following instructions from the investigation department, the police went to the apartment to check. When law enforcement officers entered the apartment, they immediately noticed a strange atmosphere. The room was quiet, and nothing indicated that it was a normal, everyday situation. However, as they searched the premises, the police came to a horrific conclusion. Anastasia's body was found in the bathroom. The bathroom was dimly lit, which only added to the grim impression of what they saw. The body was lying in the bathroom in a completely inappropriate place. An examination of the body immediately showed that death had been violent. There were multiple signs of bleeding on the body, indicating that she had been seriously injured. Several stab wounds on the body became key evidence pointing to a violent death. Soon, after a more thorough examination, investigators counted at least 6 stab wounds that had been inflicted on various parts of the body. The wounds covered the neck, chest, and abdomen. This indicated that the attack had been swift and brutal. What aroused further suspicion among investigators was the fact that the body had been moved to the bathroom. This was undoubtedly an attempt to hide the traces of the crime and change the scene of the apartment. The body was moved from the place where it was killed and left in the bathroom. This act was considered particularly significant, as moving the body indicated that the killer was aware of his action. Perhaps the perpetrator was trying to hide evidence, or later suggest that the death was accidental or did not occur at the time of the attack. However, despite these attempts to cover their tracks, other factors at the crime scene became key. After a thorough search of the apartment, the police found no signs of a struggle. No items were found at the scene that could indicate a fight or resistance on the part of the victim. This circumstance immediately caught the attention of investigators. The usual scenario for a murder in an apartment is usually a struggle. screams, damage to furniture or other items in the room with which the victim could have fought the attacker. However, in this case, everything was different. No broken objects or damage to the walls or furniture were found, suggesting that the victim had not tried to resist. Moreover, the absence of signs of a struggle could also indicate that the perpetrator was familiar with Anastasia and that she may not have expected the attack. An important aspect that the investigation could not ignore was the condition of the apartment itself. Externally, the apartment looked neat, with no signs of violence or broken items in other rooms. However, the presence of the body in the bathroom, as well as the absence of signs of a struggle, suggested that the victim may have been taken by surprise. The perpetrator may have carried out the attack when Anastasia was not expecting any danger, which suggests that she probably trusted her killer or was calm enough not to resist. Further investigation revealed that Anastasia often stayed alone in her apartment because her job required her to work long hours and spend a lot of time online. According to her friends, she often worked at night creating content for social media. It was also known that her relationship with Dmitry Chernyshov, her boyfriend, was complicated, and they often quarreled. These facts could not fail to alarm investigators. Tension in the relationship, jealousy, and possible personal problems could have triggered the perpetrator to resort to violence. Interestingly, despite the absence of signs of a struggle, Anastasia's body showed signs that she was in a state of shock at the time of the attack. The autopsy showed that Anastasia had no opportunity to react to the attack, which also indicated that she was unprepared for it. This added to the suspicions surrounding Dmitry, who was the last person she had contact with before her disappearance. The investigative team focused on establishing what could have been the motive for such a brutal attack. During the investigation, witness statements were taken and possible motives for the murder were examined. Since there were no signs of a struggle at the crime scene, and the murder itself was quick and decisive, investigators assumed that the victim had no opportunity or desire to resist her killer. This strengthened suspicions about Dmitry, with whom Anastasia was in a relationship. The bloodstains found at the crime scene and the position of the body in the bathroom also became key elements of the investigation. This gave investigators grounds for further analysis of all factors that could have led to such a tragic outcome. The police continued to work on the case, and soon additional specialists were brought in to help analyze every detail related to the murder. After Anastasia Komlovskaya's body was discovered, investigators immediately began standard procedures to solve the crime, including interviewing the victim's friends, colleagues, and acquaintances. In the early days of the investigation, most of the people interviewed said that Anastasia was a cheerful, energetic person, but that her relationship with Dmitry Chernyshov was tense. This was confirmed by both her closest friends and people who knew the couple. Already during the questioning, when investigators were gathering information about her life and possible reasons for her disappearance, the first suspicions about her partner began to arise. Anastasia's friends and colleagues noted that her relationship with Dmitry had become increasingly problematic over time. Some even mentioned that the girl had complained several times about her boyfriend's jealousy. The testimony of these people played an important role in determining the direction of the investigation. Some of Anastasia's acquaintances said that she had repeatedly mentioned that her relationship with Dmitry was becoming increasingly difficult, especially in the last months of her life. According to her friends, he was very controlling and jealous of every man she interacted with, which could have caused tension in their relationship. There was information that Dmitry not only suspected her of cheating, but was also extremely sensitive to her popularity on adult platforms such as OnlyFans, where she received significant attention from men. One acquaintance even reported seeing Anastasia and Dmitry raise their voices and threaten each other several times during arguments. These conflicts became increasingly heated and emotionally charged, and it was unclear how the next argument would end. This gave reason to believe that against a backdrop of jealousy, discontent, and constant conflict, an emotional outburst could have occurred, leading to the tragedy. Although the police did not immediately raise any specific suspicions, they began to focus on Dmitry Chernyshov. Initially, investigators focused on general facts and connections that could shed light on Anastasia's disappearance and death, not ruling out the possibility of an accident or misfortune. However, With each interrogation, it became increasingly clear that Dmitry was the prime suspect in the murder. He was the last person to see Anastasia alive, and his relationship with her became the main focus of the investigation. Particular attention was paid to changes in Dmitry's behavior after Anastasia's disappearance. This behavior became a clear indicator that his involvement in the murder might be more obvious than initially thought. In the days following her disappearance, while friends and police began searching for Anastasia, Dmitry continued to actively correspond with her followers on social media. He used Anastasia's phone and responded to messages on her behalf. His actions raised suspicions as, despite the tragedy, he did not report her disappearance to the police and continued to behave as if everything was fine with the girl. It soon became clear that Dmitry was not just responding to messages but also interacting with subscribers on the OnlyFans platform, passing them off as her own. This behavior was extremely strange and suspicious. Some people who knew Anastasia began to notice inconsistencies in the manner of communication in these messages. They claimed that the responses sent on Anastasia's behalf were not characteristic of her communication style. This was an important clue for investigators, as such actions could mean that Dmitry was not just continuing to use her phone, but was also trying to cover up the crime by creating the illusion that she was still alive. Particular attention was paid to the fact that Dmitry did not report Anastasia's disappearance to the police and did not take any steps to find out what had happened to her. Instead of calling the police or starting a search, he continued his usual activities, responding to messages and even posting on behalf of his deceased girlfriend. This fact became the first serious evidence pointing to his involvement in the crime. The police were able to trace the correspondence and establish that this behavior was not simply a mistake or misunderstanding, but a deliberate act aimed at concealing the fact of the murder. After the investigation into the use of Anastasia's phone was deepened, additional evidence emerged confirming Dmitry's involvement. He tried to present the situation as if everything was fine, creating the illusion that nothing had happened to the girl. His attempts to hide the truth became increasingly obvious. At some point, investigators noticed other oddities in his behavior, such as his refusal to give precise explanations for his actions in the days following Anastasia's disappearance, and his strange behavior in ignoring all normal procedures after the tragedy. This fact finally undermined his alibi. Armed with all this evidence, investigators began to question Dmitry more thoroughly. They discovered that, despite his assurances that he knew nothing about her disappearance, he was in fact aware of what had happened and had attempted to cover up the crime. This behavior, as well as his active use of Anastasia's phone after her death, became the main evidence of his guilt. The use of the victim's phone, attempts to cover up the crime, and manipulation of information became key moments in the case that ultimately led to his arrest and indictment. Thus, Dmitry's actions after the murder were the main factor that allowed the investigation to draw the correct conclusions about his involvement in the crime. The police did not immediately reach a final conclusion, but gradually, step by step, the evidence of his guilt became increasingly clear. In the end, these facts helped put Dmitry Chernyshov on the trail of the crime and strengthened the case against him. On August 11, 2022, Dmitry Chernyshov was arrested on suspicion of murdering his girlfriend Anastasia Komlovskaya. The police arrested him shortly after establishing that he was the last person to see her alive, and after uncovering his suspicious behavior following her disappearance. Dmitry continued to use Anastasia's phone, responding to messages on her behalf, which became important evidence in the case. This behavior attracted the attention of investigators, as it was a clear sign of an attempt to cover up the crime. At first, Dmitry denied his guilt and tried to justify himself, telling investigators that Anastasia was depressed and had repeatedly asked him for help. He claimed that she was going through a difficult period in her life and could not cope with her inner demons. Dmitry stated that Anastasia had repeatedly told him about her desire to end her life, but could not bring herself to take this step. According to him, she asked him to help her because she saw no way out of her situation and could not cope with her depression. He claimed that at a certain point she asked him to kill her because she couldn't cope with the emotional pain. Dmitri's words sounded like an attempt to justify his actions and shift the blame to Anastasia's mental health. He claimed that her requests became a heavy burden for him and he didn't know what to do. In his testimony, he claimed that he could not refuse her and agreed to fulfill her request, believing that it would be a relief for her. However, as further questioning revealed, this version of events did not correspond to reality. The investigators did not believe this version of events. Their doubts were reinforced when it emerged that after the murder, Dmitri did not report what had happened to the police or to any of her relatives. He continued to respond to messages using Anastasia's phone, which, in light of his testimony, appeared to be an obvious attempt to cover up the crime and cover his tracks. This behavior only reinforced the police suspicions, and they continued to insist on a truthful confession. During further questioning, Dmitri finally confessed to the murder. He told investigators what had really happened and how events unfolded on that fateful night. Dmitri admitted that, despite all his attempts to justify himself to the police, he could not hide the truth. He stated that on that evening, they were lying on the bed in the bedroom when another argument broke out between them. Dmitri said that arguments with Anastasia were not uncommon, especially in the last months of their relationship, when she increasingly complained of depression and personal problems. This time, the conflict became particularly heated. According to Dmitri, at some point he took out a knife which he said was nearby and in a fit of rage stabbed Anastasia several times in the neck. He noted that everything happened very quickly and he couldn't control his emotions. He admitted that he acted under the influence of aggression and jealousy that had been building up for a long time. Dmitri said that despite his cruelty, he did not want to kill Anastasia, but simply vented his aggression, not realizing the full gravity of his actions at the time. He said that after he realized what had happened, he moved Anastasia's body to the bathroom in an attempt to hide the traces of the crime. When investigators asked him why he moved the body to the bathroom, Dmitri replied that he wanted to avoid further trouble. He claimed that he decided not to report the incident to the police because he was confused and did not know how to justify himself to those around him. After that, he continued to respond to messages, trying to create the appearance that Anastasia was alive and well. He said he was trying to prevent her friends and followers from becoming upset, but in reality he was hiding his actions, which was an obvious attempt at manipulation. Dmitri's confession was an important step in solving the crime, but it did not answer all the questions. Investigators continued to examine all the details of that day's events, including possible motives and details that could shed light on why Dmitri chose to act in this way at that particular moment. One of the most important aspects investigators were looking for was motive. Dmitri claimed that his actions were caused by emotional instability and jealousy, but at the same time he did not explain why his behavior at that moment became so violent. The investigation also drew attention to the fact that after the murder, Dmitri continued to behave as if nothing had happened. Not only did he not report the crime to the police, but he also continued to use his deceased girlfriend's phone to communicate with her followers and acquaintances. This strange and inexplicable activity suggested that Dmitri was concerned about how the public would perceive his actions and wanted to hide the facts of the murder. His confession and subsequent testimony helped investigators establish an accurate picture of what happened, but the investigation did not end there. It was important to understand what exactly in their relationship triggered such an act: jealousy, personal conflicts, psychological problems. All of this turned out to be part of a complex picture that led to the tragedy. Thus, Dmitri Chernyshov's confession to the murder of Anastasia Khamlovskaya not only revealed all the circumstances of the tragedy, but also showed his actions after the crime, which became important evidence of his guilt. After Dmitri Chernyshev confessed to the murder of Anastasia Khamlovskaya, the case was referred to court. The trial began in 2023 and became a public trial that attracted public attention, especially given the tragic circumstances and brutality of the crime. The trial took place in the Frunzensky District Court of St. Petersburg. The trial examined key issues such as the motives for the crime, the defendant's behavior before and after the murder, and the evidence obtained during the investigation. Important evidence included Dimitri's confession, his behavior after the murder, and his actions to cover up the crime. Throughout the trial, Dimitri continued to claim that his actions were motivated by intense jealousy and personal problems in his relationship with Anastasia. He admitted that he was unable to control his emotions at the time of the attack, but claimed that he did not intend to kill the girl and only acted in a fit of rage. During the trial, the judge and prosecutor emphasized that the defendant's actions were deliberate and particularly cruel. Despite Dimitri's confession and attempts to justify himself, the prosecution pointed to the fact that the murder was committed with the clear intention of concealing evidence of the crime. An important factor for the court was the defendant's attempt to conceal the murder by continuing to respond to messages on Anastasia's behalf after her death, and by not reporting the incident to the police. These actions were considered an attempt to manipulate public opinion and conceal his involvement in the crime. During the hearings, testimony was also heard from witnesses, including Anastasia's friends and acquaintances, who confirmed that there were serious problems in the relationship between the defendant and the victim, including jealousy and emotional tension. The court hearings lasted several weeks. During the hearings, both sides presented their arguments. The defendant's defense claimed that Dimitri was acting under severe stress and did not realize the full gravity of his actions. In response, the prosecution presented facts confirming the premeditated nature of the murder, including Dimitri's actions after the crime. Psychological aspects were also considered, as the defendant had no previous convictions and no significant psychiatric disorders that could have influenced his behavior. The court found that the defendant was aware of the consequences of his actions and did not act in a state of affect or acute stress, as claimed by the defense. Although Dimitri did experience difficulties in his relationship with Anastasia and was influenced by his emotions, the court found that his actions were calculated and cruel. Psychological evidence did not justify his behavior, and the court took into account that he continued to manipulate the situation after the murder. After all the court hearings were completed, the defense and prosecution presented their conclusions. The prosecutor noted that despite the admission of guilt, the crime was not accidental and was not the result of a momentary outburst of aggression. The prosecution argued that Dimitri committed the murder in order to conceal his actions and manipulate those around him, which is an extremely serious crime. On January 22, 2024, the Frunzensky District Court of St. Petersburg found Dmitry Chernyshov guilty of the murder of his girlfriend, Anastasia Khamlovskaya. The court took into account all the evidence, including the defendant's confession, his behavior after the crime, and the investigation materials. It was established that the motive for the murder was personal animosity and jealousy, which escalated into violent actions. The court found that Dimitri acted with the clear intention of concealing the traces of the crime by continuing to use his deceased girlfriend's phone and responding to messages, creating the illusion that she was alive. Dmitry Chernyshov was sentenced to 8 years in a strict regime colony. The court took into account that, despite his admission of guilt, the defendant's actions were deliberate and cruel. The court also noted that the defendant's attempts to cover up the traces of the crime aggravated the severity of his actions. The sentence was handed down after a detailed analysis of all the circumstances of the case and taking into account that the victim was killed as a result of hostile relations, which indicates the high degree of danger posed by the defendant. Ildiko Kradniak was born on August 14, 1969, in Szeged, a city in southern Hungary near the border with Serbia. Her family was intelligent and modest. Her father taught mathematics at a technical college, and her mother worked as a nurse. Her parents instilled in their daughter a strong work ethic, respect for knowledge, and a desire for independence. From childhood, Ildiko was distinguished by her diligence, interest in the natural sciences, and dreaminess, which she expressed through drawing, cosmetics, and language study. At school, she was known as the Little Diplomat for her gentle nature, careful choice of words, and ability to resolve conflicts between her peers. By the time she finished high school, she was already fluent in English and wanted to pursue a career in aesthetics and body care. Inspired by her mother's stories about medicine and the human body, she enrolled in a local medical school specializing in physical therapy and dermatological cosmetology. In the early 1990s, after the fall of socialism, Ildiko moved to the United States on an education and employment visa. She first settled in Chicago, but after a few years moved to California, seeking a warmer climate and opportunities in the beauty industry. There, she obtained her cosmetology license, began working in salons, and eventually gained a reputation as a specialist with a feel for skin. By the mid-2000s, she had an established clientele, a portfolio that included treatments for celebrities and recognition among her peers. In 2012, she opened her own salon in Aliso Viejo, a small office on the first floor of an office building where women came every day for care, relaxation, and confidential conversation. Ildiko created an atmosphere of care and comfort around her. Clients often called her a psychologist with a mask in her hands. She knew how to listen, remember details, and offer support. Stephen Beale came into her life in the mid-2010s. He was a few years older, charismatic, intelligent, and interested in engineering projects, model rockets, and pyrotechnics. They met at a charity event held at a local art gallery. Stephen, who had been widowed in 2008, seemed charming and attentive. Ildiko was attracted by his neatness, his ability to speak to the point, and his interest in culture. Their relationship developed slowly but steadily. He helped her with interior repairs, accompanied her on trips, and showed her his model engine assembly projects. She supported him when he was undergoing treatment for the effects of chemicals used in his hobby. But over the years, according to friends, friction began to arise in their relationship. Jealousy, control, and differences in outlook. Ildiko became more independent, planning trips without him and discussing expanding the business. Despite the complexity of their relationship, their union lasted several years. They were not officially married, but they lived as a couple. And according to acquaintances, Stephen was emotionally dependent on her, although outwardly everything looked quite respectable. May 15, 2018 was no different from any other day. The morning was sunny. Ildiko arrived at the salon a little earlier than usual, parked her white Audi, walked through the glass doors and, as always, turned on the lights and the music player. The first clients began to arrive around 11 o'clock. The procedures went on as usual. That same morning, she received a small package. According to eyewitnesses, the box was unremarkable, neutral in color with no bright markings addressed to her personally. She brought it to her office, placed it on the table, and apparently decided to open it during a short break between appointments. At 1:00 p.m., when two other clients were still in the room, there was a loud bang. The building shook from the explosion. The walls shook and glass flew everywhere. In a matter of seconds, the room was filled with dust and smoke. Neighboring offices were evacuated. Firefighters, police, and paramedics arrived at the scene. The area was cordoned off. A woman at the entrance described what happened as an explosion that rang in my ears. Two victims were rushed to the hospital. Ildiko Krajniak, who was closest to the source of the explosion, died at the scene. Initially, it was assumed that the cause could have been a domestic accident, faulty equipment, a gas cylinder, or a short circuit. But the nature of the destruction, the smell in the air, and the characteristics of the damage suggested otherwise. This was no accident. Someone had sent an explosive device, and while the streets of Aliso Viejo were still ringing with sirens, work began in the corridors of federal agencies, cautious, methodical, and long. The investigation was just beginning. On that May day, nothing foreshadowed disaster. Until lunchtime, Ildiko Krajniak's salon was operating as usual. Pleasant music, the smell of eucalyptus, appointments for treatments, clients coming in for hair care, massages, and confidential conversations. The office was cozy and well-kept, reflecting the character of its owner, precise, calm, and confident. But all that disappeared in an instant when, around 1 p.m., the room shook from a loud bang. The explosion disrupted not only the silence, but also the very fabric of everyday life. Plaster flew off the walls, shards of glass rained down from the display cases, and alarms screeched inside. In a matter of seconds, the salon was filled with smoke and dust. People from neighboring offices rushed out into the street. 5 minutes later, Mirableu Street was already blocked off. First ambulances arrived, then the police and firefighters. There were 3 victims. 2 women survived with injuries of varying severity. The owner of the salon, Ildiko, who was closest to the source of the explosion, died at the scene. Initially, the accident was thought to be accidental, possibly faulty equipment, overheated oil, or a short circuit. However, as experts arrived, it became clear that the destruction was deliberate. Firefighters inspected the interior and found that the explosion did not come from outside. It occurred inside, near a table where a small box was standing. The plastic was torn apart, parts of the case were scattered within a radius of several meters, and burn marks were visible on the ceiling in some places. This indicated that a component with a high combustion temperature had been used. 2 hours after the incident, representatives of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, ATF, joined the investigation. Even then, suspicion began to fall on internal rather than external causes. The processing of the scene began. Forensic experts used tongs, brushes, and special analyzers to ensure that no fragment was overlooked. Numerous metal parts were found on the floor, some of them partially burned and melted. One of the clients, who was able to give a brief statement, mentioned that shortly before the explosion, Ildiko had brought a package to the office, an ordinary cardboard box, probably received through the postal service. She did not have the slightest suspicion, neither about its weight, appearance, nor smell, and yet it was this box that became the source of the tragedy. Fragments of the packaging found in different parts of the room underwent initial analysis. Traces of glue, metal particles, sharp elements, something like bearings or balls, were found on the inside of the box. Experts later confirmed that the device was homemade, designed and assembled by hand. It included a lithium battery power supply, a detonation circuit, probably via a contact detonator, and striking elements typical of unauthorized pure. A rare component was used as an explosive, leaving bright orange traces on the nearest walls and furniture. Chemical analysis revealed a substance that is not used for domestic purposes, but is found in incendiary mixtures and rocket propellants. This discovery proved to be crucial. This chemical is not sold in regular stores. It is difficult to obtain without specific knowledge or connections. This substance is typically used by people involved in technical modeling, fireworks, or industrial pyrotechnics. This feature instantly narrowed down the circle of suspects. It was not just a question of who might have wanted to cause harm, but who had the technical ability to assemble such a device. In addition, everything pointed to the fact that the perpetrator knew that Ildiko would be there at that exact moment. The package was not sent to her home address or at a random time. It was timed for a workday when she would be there in person. This meant one thing. Someone knew her schedule, habits, and routine. Investigators questioned the Postal Service employees who served the building to determine how exactly the package had arrived and at what stage it could have been replaced or planted. CCTV footage was seized. It was established that the box had been delivered by a courier service at around 10:45 a.m. and left at the reception desk of the office complex. According to the administrator, it was indeed signed for by Ildiko, with no indication of the sender, just her name and office number. This was another important detail. The perpetrator took care not to attract attention with either the packaging or the delivery method. Meanwhile, ATF laboratories and FBI experts were reconstructing the device. The assembled components indicated a high level of preparation. For example, the wire connections were neatly made using epoxy resin and heat-shrink tubing. The batteries were reliable with a good service life. This suggested that the device was not designed to detonate spontaneously, but to be triggered at a specific time. Forensic experts recreated the bomb's outline on a 3D model and concluded that it was activated when the lid was opened, causing a short circuit through the built-in circuit board. This meant that whoever sent the package expected it to be opened by the addressee. A piece of paper with a partial fingerprint was also found. It was sent to a federal database for identification. There were no results yet, but the fact that there was a fingerprint strengthened the investigators' position. The device had been assembled by hand, and this could have been a trace from one of the stages of manufacture. Meanwhile, research was being conducted on the substance. The orange powder. Chemists confirmed that the compound was unstable, dangerous when heated, and required protective equipment and expertise. Its use outside of a manufacturing environment was virtually impossible without specialized training. At this stage, investigators already understood that the perpetrator was not only technically skilled, but also had access to information about the victim. It could not have been a coincidence that the explosive device arrived on the day when Ildiko was working without an assistant. She usually had fewer clients on Tuesdays and sometimes remained alone in the office. The investigation checked internal connections, former employees, partners, clients, acquaintances. A list of people who had access to her schedule began to take shape. Investigators also noticed the absence of cameras in the office itself. This complicated the task. However, external cameras captured something interesting. Several days before the incident, a dark-colored SUV appeared repeatedly in the area near the office, stopping in the parking lot closer to the building. Its license plate number was partially deciphered. A check of the databases showed a match with a car registered to a man who had previously been in a relationship with Ildiko. At that point, it was just a thread, but an important one. The pieces gathered, the device, the rare materials, the precision of the execution, the knowledge of the schedule, all pointed to a carefully planned crime. This was not a spur-of-the-moment decision or an emotional outburst. It was calculated. That is why the investigation could not afford to rush. Every step had to be checked, every piece of evidence confirmed from different angles. The question was not only who did it, but also why. The investigation that followed the explosion became one of the most complex and sensitive operations in Orange County in recent years. In the days following the tragedy, investigators focused on reconstructing the chain of events, analyzing evidence, and studying the victim's lifestyle. As these pieces began to fit together, a man emerged from the background, whose name was mentioned more and more often in conversations with Ildiko's friends and family, but who, at first, was not considered a suspect in the crime. He was Ildiko's former partner, a man with whom she had more than just a relationship. Their relationship had lasted several years. They traveled together, attended events, and made plans for the future, but, according to her friends, it ended badly. The breakup occurred a few months before the tragedy and, according to some of her friends, was accompanied by emotional scenes, unspoken words, and moments of anxiety. Ildiko could not stand conflict, but in recent months she had reportedly been feeling increasing pressure from whom no one specified at the time. When investigators began analyzing her digital devices, her phone, laptop, and cloud services, they found messages and notes in which she mentioned tense conversations with her former partner, concerns about his excessive interest in her movements, the appearance of unsigned messages, and even a feeling of being followed. Although she never reported the threats officially, the tone of her notes, especially those made in March and April, gave investigators the strong impression that Ildiko was feeling psychological pressure but did not want to involve the police. This information was not conclusive, but it did provide a lead. It revealed a name that had not previously been linked to the incident. It was then that investigators turned their attention to surveillance camera footage from the office building where the salon was located. Several days before the tragedy, on May 9, 10, and 11, a car matching Stephen Beal's description was spotted near the entrance to the building. The camera captured an SUV parked where Ildiko's Audi usually stood. Neither the driver nor the passengers were clearly visible in the recording, but analysis of the license plate, even partially illuminated, identified it as belonging to Stephen. This fact became the first material lead. Unconfirmed but significant. Was he in the car? Why was he at her office? Was it a coincidence? The police requested a warrant for temporary access to his GPS navigation data and, within the limits of the law, for information from his phone and laptop. Once they got the go-ahead, investigators took Stephen Beale's electronic devices for analysis. At the same time, on May 18, his house in Long Beach was searched. FBI, ATF, and local police were involved. They started with his workshop and garage. Inside the rooms used to assemble model rockets, the investigation was already aware of his hobby. Chemicals, plastic containers, diagrams, and electrical circuit parts were found. At first glance, nothing illegal. Everything could be explained by his hobby. He was indeed involved in building model engines, participated in exhibitions, and communicated on technical forums. However, according to ATF experts, some of the materials found in his storage room matched the composition of those used in the homemade device that exploded in the cabin. For example, a small plastic container was seized, the inside of which had traces of the same orange substance. Rolls of wiring were also found that matched the color, thickness, and type of insulation found at the scene. A sealed bottle marked, "For experiments, do not touch," was found in the chemical storage box, in which experts later identified peroxide compounds suitable for creating unstable mixtures. However, all this remained circumstantial. None of the substances were illegal in themselves. None of the items contained any obvious signs linking them to a specific parcel. There were no fingerprints on the bomb, nor was there any direct evidence that he had sent the box. But the combination of these factors, the chemical components, the technical knowledge, the personal proximity to the victim, the confirmed presence at her office a few days before the incident, and the messages with alarming hints, began to form a coherent picture. A psychologist brought in to assist with the investigation described the possible profile of the perpetrator as technically competent, rational, but emotionally unstable and prone to control. This portrait matched the traits described by Ildiko's friends when talking about her former partner. Meanwhile, the lab kept analyzing the clues found in the wreckage. One of the experts noticed how the wires were connected in the device, an unusual use of a thin layer of epoxy resin and specific clips to hold the joints together. This technique was rare and not typical for most homemade devices. When photographs of the samples from Beale's home were compared with elements of the bomb's design, several similarities were found in the assembly method, including a characteristic mark left by the soldering tool used. In addition, experts found rough sketches on Beale's tablet, presumably made several weeks before the incident. One of them showed a model of a box-shaped device with a detonator, labeled "Prototype, Do Not Activate, Test." It was not identical to the bomb's design, but it used the same principles: a cover, a contact switch, a battery, and a switch. All this still did not allow for an indictment. However, internal reports from the investigation team already indicated that Stephen Beale was a key figure of interest. Investigators did not name him as a suspect, arrest him, or question him with a view to pressing charges. But his name was everywhere, in the file, in the chains of analysis, in the team's brainstorming sessions. It was during this period, about a week after the tragedy, that investigators began to realize that more than coincidences were needed to obtain full confirmation of his involvement. They needed certainty, which could be provided by either a fingerprint, a digital trace, or a confession. The work was just beginning, and new units were joining the investigation. Ahead lay painstaking work on the details, matching dates, routes, chemistry, psychology, and most importantly, finding the link that would tie everything together into an unbreakable chain. The investigation had reached the point where there was no longer any doubt. Everything that had previously seemed like a series of coincidences, the chemicals in the house, the old diagrams, the strange routes, now had a precise, scientifically proven explanation. Laboratory analysis showed that the composition of the lead compound found at the scene of the explosion was identical to the substance stored in Stephen Beale's workshop. The samples were compared on dozens of parameters, from the level of purification and molecular structure to micro-traces characteristic of a specific production batch. Moreover, the identity of the micro-impurities in both substances allowed investigators to conclude that these were not just similar compounds, but material from the same source. Such a result could not be explained by chance. At this stage, investigators delved deeper into the digital trail. Several technical files were extracted from Stephen's laptop. Among them were diagrams and drawings of devices that included timers, contact detonators, battery packs, and mechanical pressure activation elements. One of the documents, created several weeks before the tragedy, was a drawing that used the same components found at the scene: a plastic case, batteries, a connecting board, and a switch that activated when the cover was lifted. Formally, this could have been just an engineering sketch, but in essence it practically replicated the structure of the real device that went off in the cabin. Purchase data provided additional confirmation. Through financial documents, investigators discovered 2 orders placed by Stephen Bill on a specialized website of a pyrotechnics company in Virginia. The order was placed in April, a month before the explosion. The invoice listed orange substance 500 grams, technical cleaning. The delivery address matched the address of his workshop. Stephen used his name and corporate email address, registered during his consulting days, to place the order. This was not just an indirect hint, but a concrete document proving that he had access to the material used in the device. However, the most significant find was a fingerprint. One of the burnt fragments of the inner packaging delivered to the FBI laboratory contained a partially preserved fingerprint. It took several days to reconstruct it. Using chemical treatment, digital modeling, and layering, the fingerprint structure was restored. After checking the federal database, it became clear that the fingerprint belonged to Stephen Beale. It had been taken earlier, in 2011, when he registered as a participant in an engineering festival related to experimental technology. This coincidence became a critical element. Now the investigation had not only a motive, not only the technical capability, not only a personal connection to the victim, but also physical evidence linked to the crime scene. On May 24, 2018, at 6:40 a.m., ATF agents and county police officers arrived at a house on a quiet street in Long Beach. Stephen Beale was at home. The arrest went smoothly, without resistance. He was informed that he was being detained on suspicion of possessing explosives without the proper permits. This was a legally valid basis for holding him in custody until all procedures were completed. At the time of his arrest, he had not yet been charged with murder, but investigators already knew that it was only a matter of time. In the days that followed, the prosecutor's office, together with federal agencies, completed the indictment. The charges included several counts: intentional use of an explosive device resulting in death, attempted harm to others, and illegal possession of components of an explosive device. Everything that had previously been part of a hypothesis was now official. Every piece of evidence, chemical, digital, documentary, and fingerprint, corroborated the version that investigators had been pursuing from day one. The explosion in the car was not an accident, but the result of a precise, cold-blooded calculation by someone who knew the victim, her routine, her lifestyle, and her character. Now, Bill was no longer just Ildiko's former partner. He was the accused, and he was facing trial. The trial for the explosion in Ildiko Krajniak's salon became one of the most high-profile cases in Orange County in recent years. The case was heard in the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California in Santa Ana. The defendant was Stephen Beale, 64, a former engineer with no previous criminal record, who was into technical modeling and had been in a close relationship with the victim. The indictment was based on 4 main counts: attempted use of an explosive device resulting in death, attempted harm to others, unlawful possession of explosives, and use of a weapon of mass destruction. The hearings began in mid-2022. The trial itself lasted more than 2 years, with several breaks due to the complexity of the case, the large volume of evidence, and the need for additional technical expertise. The court hearings were accompanied by strict security measures. Representatives of federal agencies, witnesses, experts, and relatives of the victim and the defendant were present. The media, in turn, followed every stage, but most of the details, especially those concerning the nature of the device and its chemical composition, were not disclosed in full given their sensitivity. The prosecution relied on a comprehensive body of evidence, including physical evidence, digital traces, eyewitness testimony, and laboratory test results. The following points were key: the identity of the chemicals found on the defendant and at the crime scene, documents confirming the purchase of rare pyrotechnic components, electronic drawings of devices corresponding to the design of the explosion, a fingerprint on the inside of the packaging, and video footage showing Stephen's car near Ildiko's office a few days before the tragedy. The court paid particular attention to the psychological aspects of the case. Witnesses were heard, Ildiko's friends and colleagues, as well as members of her family, who reported that in the last months of her life she had been experiencing stress and tension related to her former partner. Excerpts from her personal correspondence were read out, in which she mentioned feeling watched and under emotional pressure. Although there were no direct threats in the messages, the context of the communication and the tone of the letters indicated an unstable dynamic between her and Stephen after their breakup. The defense, in turn, insisted that there was no direct intent. The lawyers argued that the technical materials found in Stephen's home were part of his hobby, and the presence of rare chemicals and diagrams did not prove his guilt. The defense emphasized that their client was a man immersed in technical experiments, passionate about engineering, and had never shown any tendency toward aggression. According to their version, the fingerprint could have gotten on the packaging accidentally while the materials were being stored. However, under the weight of systematically constructed evidence, this version gradually lost strength. The prosecution presented a complete chronological analysis, from the moment the chemicals were purchased to the shipment of the package, the route it took, the time it arrived at the office, and the moment it was opened. A comprehensive reconstruction showed that the device could not have been assembled without a precise understanding of the mechanics and knowledge of how and when the victim would come into contact with the parcel. Experts confirmed that the short circuit occurred when the lid was lifted, a detail requiring precision, and it was precisely this diagram that was found on the defendant's computer. The court heard more than 20 witnesses, including explosives experts, technical consultants, forensic scientists, and postal and courier service employees. Each testimony reinforced the main line of the prosecution. The crime was planned, carried out by a person with technical skills, and directed specifically at one victim. The sentencing hearing took place in January 2025. District Court Judge Josephine Staton delivered the closing remarks. In her speech, she emphasized that the evidence presented by the prosecution formed a continuous chain with no links of chance. She noted that the crime was calculated and deliberate, and that its consequences were devastating not only for the victim, but also for everyone who happened to be nearby. On January 19, 2025, the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California found Stephen Beal guilty of intentionally using an explosive device, resulting in death, attempted murder, and unlawful possession of components classified as weapons of mass destruction. On January 23, 2025, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole and an additional 30 years for the charges he faced. Bradley Lewis was born on October 15, 1997, in Kingswood, a small town in southwestern England, where he spent his life. His family was typical of many English working-class families. His father worked at a local factory, and his mother worked at a small pharmacy. Bradley was the only child in the family, and this may have played a role in shaping his character. From an early age, he was a source of pride for his parents, a kind and caring young man who tried not to disappoint them. At school, Bradley was not only a good student but also an active participant in school life. He was into sports, especially football, and was pretty popular with his peers. His grades were solid, and after high school he decided to go to college to continue his education. He chose a business management major, hoping to work in the business world in the future. However, his college career didn't last long. After his first year, Bradley felt that education was not fulfilling for him and decided to change the course of his life. After Bradley left school, he returned to Kingswood, where he got a job at a construction company. His hard work and determination allowed him to quickly secure a stable position in the company. He was known among his colleagues as a reliable and honest worker who was always willing to help others when they found themselves in difficult situations. In his free time, Bradley often spent time with friends, participating in various activities, and also found solace in active recreation, such as cycling and fishing. At some point in his life, Abigail White came into his life. It happened about 2 years ago when they met at a party at a pub where Bradley often spent his evenings with friends. Abigail was a bright and confident young woman who immediately caught Bradley's attention. She was a few years younger than him, but they quickly found common ground and began a relationship. Abigail, like Bradley, was from a small town, but her life had been much more difficult. She was independent and ambitious, not limiting herself in her choice of career opportunities. Their relationship developed rapidly, and a few months after they met, they moved in together. Bradley was impressed by Abigail's determination, her ambition, and her desire to improve her life. She often supported him in his plans and endeavors. Together, they began to make plans for the future, and Bradley even considered continuing his education and returning to school. But his career ambitions still came first. Abigail also seemed like his complete opposite, which at some point attracted him even more. The couple got to know each other's friends and sometimes spent time outside the city, relaxing in small cottages in the suburbs of Kingswood. It seemed like a typical romantic story of a young couple, but, as in many relationships, there were difficulties. They would argue from time to time, but they always made up, and Bradley often said that Abigail was the person he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. There was a lot of good in their relationship, but despite this, there was always something in the air, a tension that eventually came to a head. On March 25, 2022, on that fateful evening, Bradley and Abigail spent the day together. As usual, they went to their local pub, where Bradley met up with a few friends. The evening promised to be quiet, and, as always, the locals gathered at the pub to spend time together and enjoy a drink. But, as often happens, the evening did not end as they had planned. An argument broke out between Bradley and Abigail. By the time they left the pub, the tension between them was at its peak. Outwardly, nothing unusual was happening, but both were clearly in an agitated state. Bradley felt that the relationship was becoming complicated, and Abigail was upset that she had not been supported in an argument with several people she had encountered at the pub. The couple left the pub, and upon returning home, Abigail discovered the unimaginable. Bradley was lying in the kitchen with a stab wound to his chest. His breathing was weak, and despite her attempts to help, she was unable to save him. Abigail panicked and dialed 911, but the paramedics who arrived a few minutes later were unable to do anything. Bradley was dead. The police arrived at the scene, but it was not immediately clear what had happened. Abigail claimed she did not know how it had happened, and although there were obvious traces of blood, the accident theory did not seem plausible. This marked the beginning of an investigation, but the police were still unable to answer the main question: who was involved in the murder of Bradley Lewis? Description of the crime scene. When the police arrived at the scene, the situation in the house was fairly normal, which immediately alarmed the investigators. There were no obvious signs of a struggle or damage to the premises. Only 2 people were in the house: Abigail White and her deceased boyfriend, Bradley Lewis. Bradley was lying in the kitchen. Next to him on the floor was a knife with obvious traces of blood, but otherwise the scene looked quite ordinary. The only exception was the blood that covered part of the floor and kitchen surfaces, apparently left behind from the severe stab wound that caused Bradley's death. According to the police, Abigail was in shock. When she saw the officers arrive, she immediately began to tell them what had happened. Her speech was confused and sometimes interrupted, but the main points remained the same. She had tried to help Bradley, but he had died. She claimed that when they returned home, she and Bradley had continued to argue, but then he had suddenly been injured. Abigail explained that it was some kind of misunderstanding that led to the tragedy. Her words betrayed her confusion and fear, and although her testimony seemed sincere, it did not give investigators a clear picture of what had happened. Abigail approached Bradley with a knife to scare him, to shock him. She claimed that she had no intention of hurting him, but before she realized what had happened, the knife was in his chest. It all happened so fast that she didn't have time to comprehend what had happened. According to her, it was all over before she realized what she had done. When she realized that Bradley was seriously injured, she immediately tried to help him. Abigail said that she helped Bradley take off his clothes to stop the bleeding. She claimed that they did it together, but there was no time to save him. She helped him move to the kitchen, trying to use his t-shirt to cover the wound. Bradley sat down at first, but then his body fell and he was lying on his back. That was when Abigail realized that her efforts were futile. Bradley was dead. When the police questioned her, Abigail initially claimed that Bradley had injured himself. She said she didn't know how it had happened and that she was sure there had been some kind of misunderstanding. Several important questions immediately arose. Why couldn't she give a clearer explanation of what had happened in the house? Why wasn't she sure what had happened? These questions seemed important, and investigators knew they had to proceed very carefully so as not to overlook any details. Abigail claimed that she did not know who could be responsible for what had happened, and that she herself could not have struck Bradley. She also stated that when she saw him injured, she immediately tried to administer first aid, but it was too late. However, her story did not match the facts at the scene. In the kitchen where Bradley's body was found, there was a knife that turned out to be the murder weapon. It was found next to the body and looked like a regular kitchen knife. There were no other suspicious items in the room. This also alarmed investigators. Usually in cases of domestic murders, the killer or criminal leaves behind not only the victim, but also clues that can reveal their motives and the course of events. But in this case, there was nothing of the sort. All that remained was the knife, blood on the floor, and a few strange details in Abigail's testimony. Investigators began collecting evidence. Traces of blood were found on the floor where Bradley lay, but there were no obvious signs of a struggle in the house. There were no scattered items, broken or damaged objects, nothing that could indicate violence. Only the knife and traces of blood on the surface, combined with Abigail's incomplete and contradictory statements, led to the conclusion that something in this picture did not add up. She kept repeating that she didn't see who could have inflicted the wound, and despite her apparent distress, investigators began to doubt her story more and more. Was her testimony sincere, or was she hiding the truth? There were several theories that piqued the investigators' interest. The first was that Abigail could have accidentally, fatally wounded Bradley during the altercation. However, even in this case, many questions remained. Why couldn't she give more precise answers about what had happened? Why couldn't she say exactly how it happened if her version of an accident was true? The second theory was that Abigail might have been involved in a premeditated murder. Perhaps the argument was the catalyst for her actions, and when the situation got out of control, she decided to take the ultimate step. But despite these theories, investigators did not have enough evidence to say for sure what happened on that fateful evening. There were no witnesses in the house, and the surveillance camera at the pub could not provide accurate information about how the argument between Abigail and Bradley continued after they returned home. She only recorded a general moment of their conflict at the pub, which did not seem significant enough to cause such a tragedy. Around the same time that investigators discovered that Abigail had changed her story several times, they began to ask themselves new questions. There were no unusual signs of violence at the crime scene, which in theory could indicate that it was not an accident. From that moment on, the investigation was just beginning. Time and the collection of evidence would eventually reveal the truth about what happened that night. However, each step brought the investigators closer to a definitive answer, although at that point none of the theories could be confirmed. After the police began their investigation, CCTV footage from the pub where Abigail and Bradley had argued before returning home became an important part of the investigation. The cameras captured the argument, but unfortunately they did not show what happened inside the house when the couple returned. These recordings only confirmed that a serious argument had taken place between them, but they were unlikely to be decisive evidence in establishing what happened later. The police could not rely solely on these images, as they did not show what was happening inside the house. This was the first major obstacle in the investigation for the investigators, as the murder had taken place inside the house, and now they had to find out what had actually happened between the two people after they left the pub. When Abigail was questioned, her testimony began to change, which immediately caught the attention of investigators. At first, she claimed that she had not seen anything, that she did not know how Bradley had been injured, and that events had unfolded too quickly for her to comprehend. She claimed that it was all an accident, and that she could not explain who could have stabbed him or how. However, her story later became contradictory. Abigail admitted that during the argument, she had taken a knife from the kitchen. She explained that she had only intended to scare Bradley, but could not explain why the knife ended up in his chest. This admission raised many questions for investigators. At first glance, her confession seemed sincere, but the contradictions in Abigail's story immediately made investigators suspicious. Why did she first claim that she saw nothing and then admit that she took the knife from the kitchen? Why did she choose that particular moment to confess her role in what had happened? Investigators began to realize that her testimony might be distorted, which could mean that she was hiding important details or trying to justify her actions. The investigation had reached a point where it was necessary to gather as much information as possible to confirm or refute Abigail's testimony. The police continued to collect evidence. The testimony of neighbors played an important role in this process. Although they had not witnessed the crime itself, they were able to describe the couple's behavior in the days and weeks leading up to the tragedy. Some neighbors said that Abigail and Bradley's relationship had become more tense recently, that they had been arguing frequently, and that both seemed to be going through difficult times. This testimony helped investigators form a more complete picture of what was going on in their lives. However, the most important element of the investigation was the analysis of the bloody traces found in the house. When investigators examined the crime scene, they noticed details that could indicate that the murder was not accidental. The blood left on the floor and kitchen surfaces suggested that the knife wound was inflicted while Bradley was conscious and trying to respond to Abigail's actions. Blood stains on various parts of the kitchen indicated that he had tried to move, but his condition was deteriorating, which was consistent with Abigail's account of how she tried to help him after the wound was inflicted. All of this formed an important picture of the events that investigators had to piece together. The police also analyzed the knife found near Bradley's body. It was a standard kitchen knife with no particular features indicating that it had been used as a murder weapon beforehand. However, experts found that the knife was sharp enough to inflict a fatal wound with a single blow to the chest. What was surprising was that the knife was found next to Bradley's body and not in Abigail's hands, which made investigators wonder why she did not try to dispose of the murder weapon if it was indeed an accident. These details seemed strange and suggested that something in her story did not add up. The medical examiner confirmed that Bradley's death occurred quickly after he was wounded. She explained that the injury was fatal and that death most likely occurred within minutes of the blow. This fact was further evidence that the entire scene of Bradley's death was at least partially staged and that her actions were not accidental. This, of course, did not prove Abigail's direct involvement in the murder, but it became clear that she could have been involved to a significant extent. The evidence gathered and the testimony of neighbors increasingly pointed to the fact that the relationship between Abigail and Bradley was indeed tense, and that she probably made the decision to act without hesitation during the argument. Investigators began to piece together a picture of how their conflict-ridden relationship could have led to tragedy. Witness statements and analysis of the crime scene confirmed that the argument that triggered the tragedy was not accidental. Each new piece of evidence further convinced investigators that Abigail could have been involved in the murder and that she had tried to hide the truth about her actions. Now the investigators were faced with the task of not only uncovering the events of that fateful evening, but also understanding what could have prompted Abigail to make such a decision. To do this, they needed to continue gathering evidence, and each piece could be the key to solving the mystery. One thing was clear: the case was becoming increasingly complicated, and it was important to find the moment that could explain what really happened on that fateful evening that ended in tragedy. On March 28, 2022, a few days after the tragedy, Abigail White was arrested. Investigators, carefully analyzing all the evidence and testimony gathered, concluded that she was involved in the murder of Bradley Lewis. At that point, the investigation had sufficient grounds for suspicion. Abigail's contradictory statements, her inability to accurately explain what happened in the house, and numerous inconsistencies in her stories became increasingly apparent. At the same time, forensic evidence clearly confirmed that the stab wound that caused Bradley's death was inflicted intentionally, not accidentally, as Abigail herself claimed. These facts convinced investigators that Abigail may have been not only a witness to the tragedy, but also a direct participant. Abigail's arrest was an important turning point in the investigation. Despite her emotional testimony, full of fear and confusion, the police could not ignore the obvious inconsistencies and the growing amount of evidence pointing to her possible guilt. She continued to insist that she had no intention of killing Bradley and that what happened was an accident. However, her own confessions, which changed during the interrogations, became the main argument of the investigation against her. At one point, she admitted that she had taken a knife from the kitchen, but claimed that she had only intended to scare Bradley, not to fatally wound him. However, the lack of other obvious signs of violence and the flawed logic of her story contradicted this version of events. When the police presented Abigail with irrefutable evidence, her position changed. Investigators provided her with the results of a forensic medical examination, which showed that the wound inflicted on Bradley was severe and deliberate, indicating intentional action. The wound could not have been accidental. The knife had been plunged with such force that it caused death within minutes. Experts who examined the bloodstains found that the crime scene did not match the typical scenario of an accidental injury. In addition, evidence found in the house indicated that there had been no attempt to fight off the killer, which also cast doubt on Abigail's claim that it was an accident. Despite her attempts to justify her actions, investigators were convinced that she was responsible for Bradley's death. They believed that during the argument, which Abigail claimed began in the pub, she lost control of the situation. Nervousness, aggression, and pent-up emotions led her to decide to stab him. According to investigators, all of Abigail's actions that evening were the result of her rash behavior in a moment of emotional distress. When Abigail was arrested, she could no longer hide the fact that her actions had led to tragedy. Contradictions in her testimony began to work against her. At the time of her arrest, she was presented with concrete evidence, including surveillance footage from the pub, medical reports, and blood analysis results. This evidence showed that she had been actively involved in the incident and that her actions were deliberate. Investigators believed that she had not only struck the victim but also attempted to conceal the truth, possibly out of fear for her own life and the lives of her children. When Abigail was arrested, she was informed of her rights and the procedure for further action. The police conducted additional interviews with her, during which she did not deny that she had wounded Bradley, but again claimed that it was not done with the intention to kill. Investigators continued to insist that her actions were deliberate. At this stage, it became clear that Abigail was trying to mislead the investigation, which only served to strengthen suspicions. Later, analyzing the entire spectrum of events, investigators concluded that the quarrel between Abigail and Bradley in the pub was only the beginning of what led to the tragedy. The couple was experiencing serious emotional and psychological difficulties. Witnesses and neighbors reported numerous conflicts between them in recent months. Abigail repeatedly complained about Bradley, claiming that he did not support her. These circumstances only reinforced the investigators' version that during the argument at home, she was unable to control her emotions and decided to kill him. After her arrest, Abigail was taken into custody and preparations for the trial began. Investigators continued to gather all possible evidence to prove her guilt and prepare the final indictment. Every detail, every piece of information obtained from witnesses Analysis of bloodstains and other physical evidence gradually pieced together a clear picture of what happened on that fateful evening. Abigail's arrest was an important milestone in the investigation. The police were confident that she was entirely responsible for Bradley's death, and their further work was focused on proving her guilt in court. Contradictions in her testimony and inconsistencies with the reality of the events continued to raise suspicions, and investigators were confident that the truth about what had happened would soon be revealed. The trial at Bristol Crown Court began with a detailed examination of the circumstances surrounding the crime that led to the death of Bradley Lewis. Abigail White was charged with the murder of her boyfriend, and her version of events was presented during the trial. She admitted her guilt in manslaughter but claimed that her actions were not intended to kill Bradley. Abigail explained that she took a knife from the kitchen to shock and scare Bradley, but did not realize what had happened until it was too late. She claimed that during the argument she was in a highly emotional state, lost control, and could not predict the consequences of her actions. However, evidence gathered during the investigation contradicted her testimony. A forensic medical examination showed that the knife wound was intentional and aimed at a vital part of the body. Surveillance cameras from the pub confirmed that there was a conflict between Abigail and Bradley, but could not clarify what happened in the house after the couple returned home. Also, bloodstain analysis at the crime scene, along with medical examiner data, showed that Bradley died quickly, which backed up the idea that the stab was meant to cause serious harm. Despite Abigail's admission of manslaughter, the judge and jury could not ignore the fact that her actions were the result of her aggressive emotions at the time of the altercation. Investigators and lawyers argued that Abigail had the opportunity to stop her actions but continued, which ultimately led to the tragic outcome. The court also considered her behavior after the crime, when she initially tried to conceal the true circumstances of what had happened, claiming that Bradley had injured himself. This behavior raised doubts about her sincerity and whether she truly understood the consequences of her actions. The couple's personal life was also discussed during the trial. The court proceedings revealed a lot of information about the toxic relationship between Abigail and Bradley. Witnesses testified about frequent arguments and heated conflicts that occurred in their lives. This added important information to the case, emphasizing that their relationship was extremely tense, which could have been a factor influencing Abigail's behavior at the time of the crime. Particular attention was paid in court to her emotional state. According to experts, Abigail was under severe psychological pressure due to accumulated relationship problems and her difficult life situation. The defense tried to prove that her actions were provoked by emotions and aggression caused by her difficult relationship with Bradley, which could have mitigated the punishment. However, despite her admission of manslaughter and the mitigating circumstances, the court was harsh in its decision. The prosecution insisted that her actions were deliberate and that she should be held responsible for Bradley's death. The judge and jury concluded that Abigail had inflicted a fatal wound on her partner as a result of aggression that crossed all boundaries, leading to the death of a person. Although she did not have the clear intention to kill Bradley, her actions were extremely dangerous and led to tragic consequences. The court also took into account her admission of guilt, which was a mitigating factor, as well as the fact that she did not hide her actions and confessed to the murder. However, despite her remorse, the court felt that the punishment should be severe to emphasize the seriousness of her actions. On October 21, 2022, Bristol Crown Court found Abigail White guilty of the murder of Bradley Lewis. The trial also revealed details of her toxic relationship with Bradley, as well as her behavior after the crime, which added further weight to the court's decision. The court ruled that Abigail White would be sentenced to life imprisonment. However, given her guilty plea and mitigating circumstances, the sentence was set with the possibility of applying for early release after 20 years. Jamie Hahn was born in 1982 in the small town of Chocovini in rural eastern North Carolina, into a family that valued hard work and respect for others. Her parents, Bill and Margaret Kirk, were modestly well off but had strong moral values. Her father ran an insurance agency and her mother taught elementary school. They believed that good deeds start with personal example and tried to instill this in their only daughter. From an early age, Jamie stood out among her peers. Her teachers described her as a sharp-minded child with a strong sense of justice. During her school years, she participated in local debates, wrote articles for the county newspaper, and organized charity fairs. As a teenager, she already said that one day she would change politics from the inside. This was not youthful bravado. Jamie knew exactly what she wanted. After high school, she enrolled at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, majoring in political science. There, she distinguished herself as one of the most active students in her class. Her name became well known in student circles thanks to her participation in charitable initiatives, election campaigns, and debate clubs. She often took on the role of coordinator in volunteer groups and spoke at panel discussions. She was respected for both her tact and her determination. During the 2004 presidential campaign, Jamie was already working on the campaign staff of one of the candidates in North Carolina. There, she first met Nation Hahn, a student and volunteer who was as passionate about politics as she was. At the time, they were just campaign colleagues. Jamie was a senior, experienced coordinator, and Nation was a junior, ambitious assistant. Their interaction was limited to work discussions and brief conversations between rallies. Several years later, when both had other relationships and more professional experience under their belts, they happened to cross paths at a seminar on electoral reform. Nation, who had since graduated from college, was working at an educational policy think tank, while Jamie was heading up the consulting firm Sky Blue Strategies. What began as an exchange of ideas quickly grew into something more. They were united not only by their political views, but also by their outlook on life. The values they lived by were almost identical. In 2009, they got married. The wedding was attended by a small circle of friends and family. Nation wrote his own vows, and Jamie wrote a speech that, according to the guests, made even the waiter cry. Among the guests was Jonathan Broyhill, a friend of Nation's since childhood, with whom he grew up and attended the same church. He was the best man at the wedding and later became a regular guest at the Han family home. Jamie and Nation's family life was filled with working together, projects, and endless discussions of new ideas. They didn't just share a life, they shared a purpose. Their home became an informal headquarters where activists would meet in the evenings to discuss campaign strategy and share news. The place was alive. Coffee was brewing in the kitchen, and sticky notes with reminders to call the congressman or check the bills were pinned to the board. Everything here was permeated with movement. Jonathan Broyhill became practically a member of the family during this period. Jamie invited him to work with her at Sky Blue Strategies, handling financial reporting for one of the campaigns. He often came in with his laptop and dinner to go, put a stack of papers on the table, and discussed business. Sometimes he stayed late to help check the spreadsheets. Sometimes he brought ice cream and put on old movies. He didn't seem intrusive. On the contrary, he was calm, delicate, and reserved. No one would have guessed that this outward composure hid an inner tension. By 2013, the couple was preparing for another important stage in their lives. Jamie was campaigning for one of the candidates for regional office, and Nation was developing an initiative related to young leaders. There was a lot of work to do, and the house once again became the center of all their efforts. In the spring, they decided to conduct an internal audit of all their old contracts for any accidental inaccuracy. It was at this point that Jonathan offered his help, voluntarily, without being asked. Monday, April 22, 2013 began quietly. Jamie spent the morning in downtown Raleigh, in meetings, discussions, and on the phone. Nation worked from the charities office. In the afternoon, they exchanged messages. "Let's have dinner at home tonight. John is coming over to help with the paperwork." At 6:40 p.m., a familiar sedan pulled up to the house on Treetop Court. Jonathan got out with a folder under his arm, as usual. It was a familiar ritual. He and Jamie often went through reports in the evenings when there were no outside distractions. Inside, the atmosphere was businesslike. Jamie opened her laptop to check the spreadsheets, and Nation went to the kitchen to make tea. In the living room, they discussed old payments and checked the amounts. Everything looked like any other evening. Three people who had known each other for many years doing their usual work together. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about this story. The North Raleigh neighborhood was quiet and green, living at its usual pace. Dogs were being walked, lawns were neatly mowed, and it was a warm April evening. For Jamie Hahn and Nation Hahn, it was supposed to be another ordinary evening. Dinner, a little work, and maybe a couple of episodes of their favorite TV show before bed. But an hour after Jonathan Broyhill arrived, something changed. Neighbors heard muffled sounds. First, a short scream. Then a loud thud, as if something had fallen. The living room window was ajar, and a woman's voice could be heard coming from the Winstons' house. At 8:17 p.m., Sandra Winston dialed 911 and reported that she could hear screams. Something was happening in the house across the street. It was very disturbing. Someone was calling for help. 9 minutes later, a patrol car arrived at the scene. The door was unlocked. The police entered and saw Nation Hahn in the hallway. He was injured but conscious. Further inside, closer to the dining room, Jamie Hahn was lying on the floor in critical condition. Jonathan Broyhill was in the room. He was sitting on the floor with his head in his hands. He did not say a word. He did not respond to questions. An ambulance took the couple to the hospital. The police seized items at the scene and took Jonathan away for questioning. The official report stated, "Serious incident in a residential building. Investigation ongoing." So far, no suspects had been identified. The night in North Raleigh began as usual. The yards were plunged into darkness, the houses had their blinds closed, and the streetlights illuminated the asphalt with a soft yellow light. It was a little after 8 when sirens were heard on Treetop Court. Several cars with their lights flashing stopped outside a 2-story brick house with white shutters. Police officers poured out of their patrol cars, professional, collected, but visibly tense. The call had been logged as a possible assault in a residential area with victims. The officers did not expect any particular threat, but standard procedure required caution. They approached the front door, which was unlocked. Inside, it was quiet. A man was lying on the floor in the hallway, wearing a shirt and with a bloody hand. He was conscious and whispered something as he looked at the officer who approached him. It was Nation Hahn. One of the patrol officers immediately called for medical assistance while the other entered the dining room. There on the floor at the edge of the dining table, Jamie Hahn lay motionless. Next to her was a dark stain on the parquet floor, a broken chair, and scattered papers. The room was filled with a sharp smell, a mixture of blood, hot plastic from the laptop which had been working just a moment ago, and something else that was difficult to identify. Panic. Against the wall, in the shadows, sat a third person, a man in his 30s. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the floor. It was Jonathan Broyhill. He showed no resistance, made no attempt to escape, and did not utter a word. His hands were free but trembling slightly. The police approached calmly without rushing and led him to a patrol car, first making sure he was unarmed. He did not resist. The first officers to arrive at the scene did not jump to conclusions. It was decided to immediately block access to the house and call in the investigative team on duty. 40 minutes later, 2 plainclothes officers arrived at Treetop Court. Detective Justin Hill and Lieutenant Carla Mason, representatives of the Raleigh Police Department's Major Crimes Unit. Hill, a short, stocky detective with 20 years of experience, was the first to enter the house. He didn't ask any unnecessary questions. He carefully examined the hallway, then the living room, where the computer was on the table, and then the dining room. Every step was methodical. Meanwhile, Carla Mason talked to the patrol officers, checking their reports and making sure that any potential evidence was secure. The room was messy, but not chaotic. It was obvious that there had been a struggle between the people in the house. Several papers lay on the floor, reports, printed tables, political notes, a document titled Q1 Campaign Reconciliation Etherage, was open on the laptop screen. A knife lay on the kitchen counter next to the sink. It was from a set that had been standing on the counter. Traces on the floor, dried drops, fingerprints, everything was recorded in accordance with procedure. Forensic photographers began their work almost immediately, using white-numbered signs and placing them throughout the incident area. The crime scene was filled with the quiet clicks of camera shutters. The ambulance that arrived after the police worked in a coordinated manner. Jamie Hahn was immediately placed on a stretcher. Her condition was listed as critical. Deep wounds to her abdomen and shoulder, signs of significant blood loss. Nation Hahn was in more stable condition but also suffered serious injuries, presumably from the collision or struggle. Both were taken to WakeMed, the largest medical facility in Wake County. Paramedics attempted to stabilize Jamie en route using mobile equipment, inserting a catheter and starting an IV. Nation was conscious and able to give his name but did not respond to questions. This fact would later play a role in piecing together the timeline of events. While work continued at the house, officers began interviewing neighbors. The first were Sandra and Tom Winston, an elderly couple who lived across the street. It was Sandra who called the police. According to her, at around 8:10 p.m., she heard a scream and then what sounded like someone calling for help. A few seconds later, she heard a man's voice. There was panic. It was unexpected. At first, I thought something had fallen, but then it became clear that it was serious. The neighbor on the right, Holly Chen, noted that at around 6:45 p.m., she saw a car parked outside the Hahn home. She recognized the car as belonging to Jonathan Broyhill, whom she knew from previous visits. He was there often, especially in the evenings. Everything looked normal, she said. The guest's behavior did not arouse any suspicion. The police also checked street surveillance cameras installed at the corner of the block. The footage shows a silver sedan pulling into the street at 6:42 p.m. and stopping near the Hahn home. There was no further movement. The cameras did not record anyone else entering or leaving the house. This confirmed that only 3 people were in the house at the time of the incident. Detectives decided to seize the laptop, tablet, and both mobile phones found in the house. These devices were sealed and sent to the police department's laboratory for further analysis. The documents opened on the laptop attracted the most attention. Spreadsheets, reports, and letters dated several days before the incident. An unsent draft letter was also found, saved in a local folder. Financial review pending. Immediate attention. The recipient's name did not appear in the draft, but the content suggested possible accounting irregularities. At that point, this did not raise any specific suspicions, but it was noted as an item for further investigation. No charges have been filed yet. The crime has been classified as aggravated assault with unknown motive. The investigation was just getting started. The morning of April 23, 2013, started with a quiet alarm at WakeMed Hospital. While doctors continued to fight for Jamie Hahn's life, police officers working at the scene began to piece together the first logical links in the chain of investigation. Nation Hahn, who was in stable but weakened condition, was briefly questioned in the presence of doctors. Detective Justin Hill entered the room early in the morning. Nation was sitting upright with a bandage on his chest and an oxygen mask nearby. He spoke with difficulty but tried to be as precise as possible. When Hill asked him about the events of the previous evening, Nation replied simply, "It happened suddenly. We were working. Jamie was discussing something. I was in the kitchen. Then, it all happened in seconds. I heard a scream. I don't remember much else." When the detective asked a follow-up question about whether he could identify the attacker, Nation shook his head slightly. "I'm not sure. It's all too foggy. I'm sorry." The doctors interrupted the conversation, citing the patient's physical and emotional exhaustion. Officially, the testimony was recorded as incomplete, with no mention of a third person in the house. The police had no grounds to make specific charges yet, only facts. There were 3 people in the house, 2 in the hospital, and 1 detained for questioning. Realizing that the key to the motive might lie not only in the events of the evening, but also in the preceding context, investigators decided to focus on Jamie's work. Through Sky Blue Strategies, she ran the campaign of former Congressman Bob Etheridge, and it was through this connection that Jonathan Broyhill came to the House. His involvement in the financial management of campaigns had been documented since 2010. He had access to all payment documents, reports, and accounting records. Jamie's laptop, which had been seized the day before, contained a number of open files, among which tables with the headings Reconciliation Q1 and notes Double Check, Discrepancy, and JB attracted particular attention. These documents mentioned transactions made on behalf of various individuals, but they were linked to recurring addresses that matched Broyhill's registration. Some amounts were of particular interest: $2,800.00, $3,500.00, and $5,200.00, all listed under external contractors. At the same time, Jamie mentioned unexplained debits in her comments. Detective Carla Mason instructed a police financial analyst to conduct an urgent reconciliation with the banks that served Etheridge's campaign. At the same time, conversations began with Sky Blue Strategies employees. The first to be interviewed was Emily Harris, Jamie's assistant. She described Jonathan as calm, a little withdrawn, but hardworking. However, she said that his behavior had changed in recent months. He had become more prone to outbursts, forgetting basic details, coming to work without his laptop, and asking colleagues to send him documents that he previously had direct access to. He complained about his health several times, mentioning that his cancer had returned. Emily did not ask any questions, taking his word for it. Her testimony coincided with what Justin Craig, another agency employee, later said. He also heard Jonathan mention his illness. He said once that his time was limited. We all thought it was related to his treatment. He said he didn't want anyone to know. The investigation team sent requests to regional cancer centers and large private clinics in North Carolina. The response was the same. No patient with that name was listed in their records. This aroused serious interest in the investigation. Too many people had heard about Jonathan's alleged illness, but no one had seen a single document. Moreover, a search of his apartment turned up no prescriptions, appointments, or packaging for specialized medications. The lawyers set up it all looked like a carefully maintained legend. On the same day, Detective Justin Hill met with Robert Manning, a friend of the Hahn family who knew Jonathan Broyhill well. They met at the office where volunteer meetings had previously been held. Robert himself contacted the police, wanting to share an important detail. He said that he had talked to Jonathan about his diagnosis on several occasions, sympathized with him, and once even gave him money for medicine. The amount was small, but the fact that he trusted him was significant. When Hill asked if he had seen any medical documents, Robert replied, "No, it was all verbal." I didn't doubt him. We were friends. This episode added another element to the picture. Jonathan not only talked about his illness, but also accepted help, both financial and moral, under the pretext of it. Against this backdrop, the police continued to analyze the contents of Jamie's laptop. One of the drafts found in the drafts folder was an internal memo titled Financial Inconsistencies, Urgent. It mentioned specific dates, amounts, and Jonathan's last name without providing any context. The file had not been sent but was dated 2 days before the incident. This suggested that Jamie was planning to take some action based on the analysis of the reports. Perhaps to discuss the problem with her husband, perhaps with Jonathan himself. By the end of April 23, investigators had several pieces of information that did not yet add up to a charge, but formed a pattern of alarming coincidences. Jonathan Broyhill was at home at the time of the incident. His name appeared in documents with suspicious financial transactions. Despite all these circumstances, the official report still did not name a suspect. The investigation remained cautious. Police representatives at a briefing on the evening of April 23 stated, "The work continues. The circumstances and materials are being analyzed. Any versions will be announced only after the initial stage is complete." Meanwhile, the press began to speculate. The first discussions appeared on social media, but the names of those involved remained unnamed. The public knew only one thing. Something inexplicable had happened in the house where two respected people lived, and where everything had seemed perfectly normal until the very last moment. The morning of April 24 began with silent anticipation, but ended in a tragedy that could no longer be explained as an accident or misunderstanding. At 7:39 a.m., the Raleigh Police Department received an official report from Wake Med Hospital. Jamie Hahn had died from her injuries. Despite the efforts of medical personnel, her condition had deteriorated throughout the night. Doctors pronounced her dead from a combination of massive blood loss and internal organ damage. The news spread quickly, first through official channels, then reaching the media. Jamie's name was made public for the first time. Her death marked the transition of the investigation from the fact-finding stage to the legal prosecution phase. Almost simultaneously, forensic experts began their work at the city morgue. The report, prepared closer to noon, described the location and nature of the injuries. The conclusion contained wording that allowed for an unambiguous conclusion. The injuries were inflicted at close range, with a household weapon, with the direct intent to cause harm. Traces of a struggle on the body indicated an attempt to defend himself. The expert group noted separately that the blows were aimed at vital areas. This confirmed the theory that the attack was deliberate. At the same time, digital materials were being processed. The police department's cybersecurity service analyzed the contents of Jonathan Broyhill's phone and email. The browser logs contained searches made several days before April 22, how to disappear without a trace, legal ways to change your name, and traveling between states without documents. Some of these queries were deleted manually but were recovered from the system cache. Email correspondence also raised questions. One email sent a week before the events to a temporary email address contained alarming phrases: "I've lost control. Everything is getting out of hand. I can't hide anymore." A financial audit completed a reconciliation with election reports submitted by the campaign headquarters of former Congressman Bob Etheridge. Jamie's suspicions were entirely justified. The election account was the source of illegal transfers totaling more than $45,000. The transfers were disguised as payments for consulting services. Several signatures were found to be forged. A graphological analysis showed that the handwriting did not match Jamie Hahn's originals. Jonathan Broyhill was listed as the approving person. He signed the reports himself without management approval. The money was transferred to accounts registered in the names of third parties associated with him at his place of residence. At around 3:30 p.m., the police obtained a search warrant for Jonathan's apartment. The address was in Durham, North Carolina, a one-room apartment in a residential complex on the outskirts of the city. A team of 4 officers and a homicide detective arrived at the scene. Jonathan was under administrative supervision at the time, but had not yet been named as an official suspect. However, the results of the search put an end to any doubt. Inside the apartment, everything was neat, almost sterile. In the closet were 2 folders with medical documents, including copies of certificates with the logos of medical institutions where, as was later confirmed, he had never been examined. Upon closer inspection, it turned out that most of the seals were digital copies printed on a printer. Next to them were blank forms, brochures from cancer centers, and questionnaires, some of which had been partially filled out by hand. Among his personal papers was a stack of letters, some in envelopes addressed to Jamie and Nation Hahn. None of them had been sent. Almost all of them contained vague apologies, phrases about trust, feelings of guilt, and fragments presumably written in a state of extreme agitation. "I wanted to be better," one read. Another said, "I couldn't stop, I was afraid, I'm sorry." The laptop confiscated from the apartment showed activity on the day of the incident. Several files were deleted about an hour before the visit to the Hahn home. One of them was a text document titled Exit Plan NXT, which was recovered using specialized software. Inside was a list of possible actions: go west, leave a note, take only cash. There were also saved drafts of letters, including one presumably addressed to his parents. These materials were seized and added to the case file. At 6 p.m. that day, the Raleigh Police Department held a press briefing. For the first time since the investigation began, an official statement was made. Jonathan Broyhill is charged with first-degree murder in the death of Jamie Hahn and aggravated assault causing serious injury to Nation Hahn. His status was changed from a person in custody to a person under arrest. He was read his rights. He did not respond to the charge. According to officers, he behaved calmly during the procedure, did not resist, and did not ask any questions. Thus, less than 2 days after the attack, the investigation completed its initial phase. Evidence was collected. The link between financial fraud and the events of April 22 was confirmed, and a motive began to emerge. A trial lay ahead, but even at this stage, the public began to realize that what had happened was not a spontaneous conflict. It was the result of a well-thought-out, albeit desperate plan. A plan born of fear, lies, and mounting internal pressure. The trial of Jonathan Broyhill began in the spring of 2014, almost a year after the tragedy. During this time, investigators gathered an impressive amount of evidence. Financial documents, witness statements, digital forensics, medical examiner reports, and reconstructed correspondence. All of this material was handed over to the Wake County District Attorney's Office. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Douglas Fahey, a man with a reputation as a tough but level-headed professional known for his previous high-profile cases. Jonathan was defended by attorney Charles Pearson, who specialized in cases with psychiatric components. From the outset, the defense's position was based on the argument that the defendant was not in a stable mental state and was acting under severe emotional distress. The hearings were held in Raleigh District Court, Courtroom No. 3. The case was heard by a jury. Public interest in the trial was high. Journalists, Jamie Hahn's colleagues, former political campaign staff, and members of non-governmental organizations were regularly present in the courtroom. For many, this trial was not only a legal but also a symbolic moment, an opportunity to get answers to the question of how and why the tragedy occurred in a home filled with trust. The trial lasted 9 days. Over 20 witnesses testified during the hearings. Nation Hahn took the stand on the 3rd day, speaking calmly, pausing frequently as he recounted the events of that evening. He described in detail the moment when he heard his wife scream, rushed into the room, and saw her on the floor with a man they trusted standing next to her. He did not mention the man's name, leaving the fact of the attack to the investigation. Next to testify were employees of Sky Blue Strategies, friends of the family, and experts in digital technology and banking operations. During the interrogation by the prosecutor's investigator, handwriting analysis reports were presented confirming that the signatures on the campaign documents had been forged. The testimony of financial analysts confirmed the scheme for transferring funds to accounts, as well as Jonathan's involvement in preparing the reports that Jamie had tried to double-check in the days leading up to the incident. The defense attorney emphasized the emotional state of the defendant. Reports from psychologists were presented, indicating episodes of depression, high levels of anxiety, unstable sleep, and a tendency towards self-harm. The defense insisted that Jonathan's actions were not cold-blooded, but rather the result of mental deterioration caused by fear of exposure and a personal crisis. However, the conclusion of an independent forensic psychiatric commission presented in court indicated that the defendant was aware of the nature and consequences of his actions at the time of the crime. This conclusion became a key argument for the prosecution, confirming that Jonathan Broyhill acted with full understanding of what was happening, seeking to conceal financial crimes. The trial came to a head when the prosecutor presented a recovered document, Exit Plan, DNL, found on Broyhill's laptop, which contained a list of steps to disappear, including change name, leave without explanation, and delete evidence. This was the final piece of the prosecution's case, showing an intent to flee before, not after, the incident. After the trial, it took the jury less than 8 hours to reach a unanimous verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read the verdict. On April 27, 2014, the Raleigh District Court found Jonathan Broyhill guilty of the following crimes: first-degree murder of Jamie Hahn, first-degree attempted murder of Nation Hahn, fraud using forged financial documents, and grand larceny of funds belonging to a federal election campaign. On May 2, 2014, Jonathan Broyhill was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Kimberly Karen Mota de Oliveira was born on May 5, 1998 in the small town of Manacor in the state of Amazonas in northern Brazil. It was a town where life flowed slowly and peacefully, surrounded by river channels and tropical greenery. Her family belonged to the middle class. Her father taught history at a school, and her mother worked as a nurse at a local clinic. They raised their daughters strictly but fairly, instilling in her a strong work ethic and a sense of responsibility. Kimberly grew up shy but observant, started reading early, became interested in biology, and even in elementary school confidently said that she wanted to be a doctor. She stood out among her peers in her studies, always prepared, always asking questions with clear goals. Her report card rarely contained comments, but often praise from her teachers. After graduating from high school, she enrolled in the medical school at the Federal University of Amazonas in Manaus, one of the largest cities in the region. To do so, she had to leave her family home, travel hundreds of kilometers, and start adult life in a city where she knew no one. Her parents were proud of her, but they were also worried. Manaus was completely different, noisy, densely populated, with a rhythm that took getting used to. Kimberly rented a small room near the campus and got a job as an assistant at a private clinic. Her studies took up most of her time, but she never complained. On the contrary, she was proud of her choice and took steps to achieve her goal. In 2019, she entered a municipal beauty contest and won. She was crowned Miss Manacor 2019. From that moment on, she became a familiar face at the university, on social media, and at city events. But for Kimberly herself, it wasn't an end in itself, but an opportunity to talk to people, to help, to be heard. Her Instagram was filled with photos of her in a white coat, captions about medicine and responsibility, quotes about compassion and choice. She met Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez in February 2020 at a sports club where she worked out from time to time. He was 31, a fitness trainer with a strong build, a calm manner of speaking, and an outwardly affable demeanor. In the first weeks of their relationship, Kimberly told her friends that he was very attentive and confident. He took an interest in her studies, often asking questions and remembering details. He said he appreciated strong and intelligent women and respected her ambitions. It all started easily. Walks together, cafes, good morning messages. She saw it as a new but not risky beginning. After 2 weeks, they started dating. However, by the end of March, traits began to emerge in his behavior that Kimberly didn't want to notice at first. He became increasingly interested in where she was, who was with her, and why she took so long to respond to messages. He asked for her phone password several times, just so he could trust her. She refused. This was followed by silence, disapproving looks, and reproaches. He began to question her schedule, saying that she was always busy and not paying attention to him. In a message to a friend, she wrote, "He's changed. He controls me all the time as if I'm not a person, but his property." She began to distance herself. In mid-April, Kimberly decided to end the relationship. She didn't want any drama, she just stopped answering his calls. But Rafael didn't give up. He continued to write to her, came to her house, left notes, waited for her at the entrance to the university. In early May, he wrote her a long message, without complaints or demands. He said he realized his mistakes, asked for forgiveness, and begged for one last meeting. "I just want to explain everything. No pressure, just once, please." Kimberly hesitated. Her close friend said she didn't want to go, but she still had doubts. On May 9, she sent a voice message. "He's asking to meet again. He says it will be the last time, that he understands everything. I don't know. Maybe I should just end it." Her friend replied that she should be careful. Kimberly wrote back, "I understand. I'll just talk to him. That's all. On the evening of May 10, she sent her mother a short message. "Mom, I'm at Raphael's today. Everything's fine, don't worry." This was nothing unusual. They knew who Raphael was and that he had been her boyfriend until recently. Even despite their recent breakup, the family did not feel alarmed. Her mother wished her a good evening and put down her phone. At 7:43 p.m., Kimberly sent her friend a final message. "If I don't get in touch, he's convinced me again. Just kidding, of course. Everything will be fine." Since then, the phone has been silent. On the morning of May 11, her mother tried to contact her daughter. The calls went through, but no one answered. At first, this caused slight concern, but by noon it became clear that something was wrong. Kimberly always let her know if she was going to be late. She never left her phone off. By the evening of May 11, her parents arrived in Manaus and headed to her apartment. The door was locked and there were no lights on inside. Neighbors said they hadn't seen her since the previous day. She didn't show up for class. Her social media accounts remained inactive. Kimberly's mother filed a missing person report. The next day, the police began a search. No one had yet uttered the word crime. Everyone hoped that the girl had simply left, was tired, and had decided to disappear for a day. But with every passing minute, it became clear that she had not disappeared. She was somewhere. No one just knew where. May 11, 2020 began like any other Monday, but for Kimberly's family, it seemed strange from the very first hours. Her mother, having received no messages or answers to her calls in the morning, sensed something that defied logic. For the past 2 years, Kimberly had been living on her own in Manaus and had never left her family without a word. She wrote almost every day, briefly but regularly, how her day had gone, how her studies were going, what she had planned for tomorrow. And now, not a word, not a sound. Saturday passed. Sunday passed. And now it was Monday. The phone was not turned off. Calls were coming in, but there was no answer. Closer to noon, her mother dialed again, then again. Then she called Kimberly's friend, the one to whom her daughter had sent her last message the day before. She replied that she hadn't heard anything since morning. Then she tried to text her. Only a single message appeared, as if the phone was on but not receiving data. Her parents didn't wait. On the evening of May 11, they left Manacor and arrived in Manaus late that night. They went straight to Kimberly's apartment. The lights were off. They knocked, waited, talked to neighbors, but there was no sign of their daughter. The door was locked. The house was a typical 2-story building with an external entrance and simple metal doors. The neighbors hadn't noticed anything unusual. No screams, no noise, no strangers visiting. Someone recalled seeing her 2 days earlier. That was all. The trail ended there. Her parents filed an official missing person report. The police began gathering information. Their first step was to check her place of residence. The next day, May 12, officers from the Missing Persons Department returned to the address. They knocked on the door, questioned the neighbors again, and contacted the mobile phone operator to track the last signals from her phone. It had been turned off on the night of May 11. There was no data on her movements. Around noon, investigators contacted the building manager and gained access to the archive of CCTV footage from cameras installed at the entrance. Footage from May 10 at around 9:15 p.m. shows Kimberly entering the building with a man. The faces are difficult to make out, but the silhouette of the girl is recognizable. She is wearing a white blouse and dark jeans. The man is wearing a black t-shirt and a cap. After that, there is no footage of Kimberly leaving the building. Only the man, about 2.5 hours later, at 11:40 p.m. leaves alone. This was the first alarming sign. Investigators recorded the video fragment, noted the timestamps, and returned to the door of the apartment where, according to neighbors, the girl had entered. The door was closed, and there were no sounds from inside. With a warrant, police officers broke the lock. Inside it was quiet. The lights were off and the place seemed empty. The apartment had only 2 rooms, a living room combined with a kitchen and a small bedroom. There were no signs of a struggle in the hallway or kitchen area. Everything was in its place. A glass on the sink, a shirt thrown over the back of a chair, a charger in the outlet. But in the bedroom, the scene had changed. The body of a young woman was found near the bed. It was lying partly on the floor and partly on the rug, with its back to the wall. The body had multiple injuries, visually identified as stab wounds. Next to it was a blanket, as if thrown on top in a hurry. Under the bed, wrapped in a kitchen towel, a kitchen knife with a wooden handle was found. There were brown marks on the floor and similar marks on the door handle. Whether the items in the room were not scattered. The window was closed, the curtains drawn. On the bedside table was a medical book, glasses, and next to it a woman's handbag. But there was no phone inside. Investigators carefully examined the scene. They noted that the door had not been broken down, the lock was intact, and there were no signs of forced entry. This suggested that the girl had entered the apartment of her own free will and knew where she was going. A preliminary examination of the body showed that death had most likely occurred on the night of May 10, 11. The condition of the body was consistent with this time frame. A knife, a towel, pieces of fabric from the floor, and samples from the door handles were seized. All these items were sent to the forensic laboratory. Fingerprints from the knife and door handle were sent for examination. In addition to the body and the knife, a small gold pendant on a chain was found in the room. It was lying at the edge of the bed, as if it had been torn off. Kimberly's mother later confirmed that it was a birthday present. She wore it almost every day. The police immediately began to establish the identity of the man who had entered the house with her. No name has been released yet. The cameras did not provide clear images, and at this stage, no one has been officially named as a suspect. Investigators worked methodically, reconstructing Kimberly's movements over the past 2 days. It was established that on May 10, she did indeed text her mother that she was on her way to see a friend. Later, her friend showed the correspondence where Kimberly refers to him by name, Raphael. In the messages, she mentions that she is planning a short meeting with no further plans, just for a quiet chat. No traces of other people's presence were found in the apartment. There were no clues indicating a break-in or outside interference. All items were in their places. Detailed data from the camera confirmed that after 11:40 p.m., no one else left the apartment. According to the recording, Raphael left the building alone. At this stage, the investigation was dealing with the fact of death. The crime scene was secured. The cause of death was preliminarily established as multiple injuries. Evidence was collected. The camera footage was partially restored. The name of the man with whom she had entered the apartment had not yet been officially released. The investigation was just beginning. There were many questions. Where was her phone? Why didn't the neighbors hear anything? Why didn't anyone call the police, even though it was late? Who exactly was with her in the apartment during those 2.5 hours, and where did he go? From that moment on, the investigation moved on to the next stage, reconstructing Kimberly's last day and finding out who was with her at that moment. After Kimberly Karen Mota de Oliveira's body was found in an apartment in downtown Manaus, the investigation moved into the next phase. The circumstances of her death were already clear. The girl did not take her own life, and she was not alone in the apartment where she was found. But it was still unclear who was with her that evening and what exactly happened during the 2 hours between her arrival and the moment when the cameras recorded a man leaving the house alone. Most importantly, there were no official charges. A reconstruction of events was needed, based not on guesswork, but on a chain of facts. Investigators started with the basics. Her phone. It wasn't with Kimberly. Her bag was in the bedroom, but her mobile device was gone. The first theory was that someone had taken it to hide information. This wasn't unusual. Smartphones are often where people keep a record of their last few hours. Digital forensics experts requested data from the mobile operator to track the last signal. According to this data, the phone was turned off in the area of Rua Pedro Batista, about 600 meters from the crime scene. This led investigators to believe that the device might have been discarded. The next day, operatives searched trash cans in the area. In one of the bins, wrapped in a bundle of paper towels, they found a smartphone that looked like Kimberly's. It was in working order, but had been reset to factory settings. Nevertheless, forensic experts managed to extract the SIM card and, using special software, recover some of the deleted messages, backups, and chats. From the WhatsApp correspondence, partially restored using cloud data, investigators learned that on the eve of the meeting, Kimberly had written the following to her friend. "He's insisting again. He says he just needs to explain himself. I don't want to, but I'm afraid he'll come over." A few days earlier, she mentioned that she was trying to avoid contact. "I deleted his number. He's threatening to find me at school. I'm tired." These messages did not mention any names directly, but in a conversation with her friend, the phrase, "he says he'll change everything, Rafael just doesn't understand that it's over," appeared. The friend later confirmed that she was talking about Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez. At the same time, investigators analyzed CCTV footage. In addition to the recording from the entrance to the building where she was seen on the evening of May 10, investigators examined other footage from nearby intersections, bus stops, and streets. One of the cameras captured the moment when the same man, presumably Rafael, leaves the building, turns around, and heads toward the main street. A few minutes later, another fragment shows him on the other side of the block. He is not using transportation but walking. This confirmed that he left the apartment without Kimberly late at night and apparently took her phone with him. The next important part of the investigation was interviewing the neighbors. On the first day, immediately after the body was discovered, no one reported any unusual noises or strange sounds. But 2 days later, one of the residents of the building, an elderly man who lived one floor below, contacted the police. He said that on the night of May 12, at around 10:30 p.m., he heard a woman's voice. He did not remember the words, but the tone seemed alarming to him. Another witness, a middle-aged woman who lived next door, gave a more detailed account. She heard a phrase that, according to her, she still cannot forget. "You have no right." It sounded sharp, as if in the heat of an argument. After that, there was silence. She did not call the police that night because she did not hear anything else and decided it was just a normal argument. These details allowed investigators to establish a preliminary timeline. Kimberly entered the building at around 9:15 p.m. According to neighbors, the argument took place at around 10:30 p.m. The man leaves alone at 11:40 p.m. Between these moments, something happened that led to her death. Based on a time analysis, experts made a preliminary conclusion that the actions that led to the tragedy took place between approximately 10:15 p.m. and 11:00 p.m. At the same time, forensic experts analyzed the contents of the apartment. Fingerprints taken from the knife and the inside of the bedroom door handle were sent to the database. A day later, experts confirmed that the fingerprints matched those of Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez, which had already been registered in the database in connection with the processing of documents and passport data. At this stage, despite a wealth of circumstantial evidence, the investigation had not yet brought any formal charges. There was still no direct evidence of intent to cause harm. However, the nature of the evidence, the behavior of the alleged perpetrator, the deleted messages, and the phone found at the scene all pointed to the fact that the meeting that ended in tragedy was not spontaneous. After she left, Rafael did not go to the police or tell his family or neighbors that Kimberly might have left the apartment. He simply disappeared. The disappearance of the person with whom she had last been seen aroused the logical interest of the investigators. Later, a neighbor from the gym was interviewed who recognized Rafael from the description. She confirmed that he had previously exhibited obsessive behavior, was controlling, often asked other girls about their personal lives, and offered help that sometimes seemed inappropriate. All of this painted a picture of a man who wanted to control relationships and was afraid of losing control. The police did not make any premature statements. The suspect's name did not appear in the media or in official comments. But within the investigation team, they understood that the chain of evidence was forming a clear picture. The next step was to find Rafael and question him. Until then, everything remained within the realm of speculation, albeit increasingly well-founded. At this stage, the investigation focused on finding the man who, according to all the evidence, had been with Kimberly on the day of her disappearance. His whereabouts were unknown. Contact with him was lost that same night. His phone was off, and he did not show up at work. There was only one goal left: to find him. 3 days after the tragedy, on May 15, 2020, investigators officially identified the man with whom Kimberly Karen Mota de Oliveira spent her last evening. He was Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez, a 31-year-old resident of Manaus who had previously worked at a fitness center near the university where Kimberly studied. His name had already been mentioned several times in his girlfriend's testimony, and now, with the help of surveillance camera footage, digital evidence, and fingerprints, it became clear that he was the one who accompanied her that evening and then left the house alone 2.5 hours later. By the time the police arrived at his home, Rafael had already disappeared. The apartment where the crime took place belonged to him. He had moved out the day before the investigation team arrived, leaving behind only items of no value. His cell phone was turned off, and his social media accounts had been either deleted or deactivated. According to investigators, all these actions indicated that he was deliberately trying to conceal his whereabouts. Moreover, in the first 24 hours after his disappearance, he withdrew some money from his bank account and then bought a bus ticket to the city of Porto Velho in the neighboring state of Rondônia. Using footage from a camera that recorded his departure from the bus station in Manaus, the police began tracking his movements through regional terminals. However, Rafael, realizing that he might be under surveillance, avoided large transfer hubs and tried to change routes. His final destination, as it later turned out, was the city of Paracatu in the state of Minas Gerais, about 2,000 kilometers from Manaus. He had distant relatives living there, with whom, according to operational data, he hoped to find temporary refuge. On the morning of May 15, at the Paracatu intercity bus station, federal police officers who had received a tip the day before detained a man who identified himself as Mateus Ferreira. He had a fake document with that name on it, as well as a travel backpack containing a change of clothes, an ATM card, a SIM card without an active number, and several handwritten notes with addresses, phone numbers, and routes. He did not resist arrest. After his fingerprints were checked, his identity was confirmed. During his transfer to the police station, Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez initially refused to make a statement. However, after consulting with a lawyer a few hours later, he agreed to undergo preliminary questioning. His first words were, "I just wanted to talk. I didn't want it to end like this." He claimed that the meeting with Kimberly was initiated with the aim of reconciliation, that they talked, argued a little, and then everything got out of control. However, he did not answer the question of why he left the apartment alone and did not inform anyone about her condition. The Amazonas State Prosecutor's Office has formally charged him with a crime punishable by death for intentional homicide. Aggravating circumstances include his close relationship with the victim and his attempt to cover up the crime, including destroying personal data and fleeing the scene. The indictment specifically states that the crime was committed in the context of an interpersonal conflict against a backdrop of control and psychological pressure, which is a typical feature of so-called femicide, a crime in which a woman is killed by a former or current partner. At a press conference held that evening, a police representative stated, "We have confirmation that he accompanied the victim on the last day of her life, was alone with her in the apartment, and that it was after this event that she stopped communicating. The evidence points to his involvement, and his behavior after the incident confirms his intention to avoid responsibility." After his arrest, Rafael was placed in a detention center in Belo Horizonte awaiting transfer back to the state of Amazonas. Local authorities acted quickly. His status was changed to suspect, then to defendant, with formal charges and detention without bail. For the investigation, his capture was a turning point. Now they had not only a bunch of indirect evidence, but also the guy himself, whose behavior backed up the story that he was involved. Even though he had the formal right to a defense and was presumed innocent, The investigation was already shaping up into a logical story. There were weeks left before the trial, but in the public, in the press, and on social media, the name Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez had already become firmly established in people's minds as the name of the man with whom Kimberly had spent her last evening. The trial for the murder of Kimberly Karen Mota de Oliveira began in June 2020 in the Criminal Court of Manaus, the capital of the state of Amazonas. The defendant was Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez, the victim's 31-year-old ex-boyfriend. The prosecution's case was based on a combination of direct and circumstantial evidence gathered during the investigation and was accompanied by intense public and media attention. This was not just a private trial. In the eyes of many, it became a symbol of a broader problem that was increasingly being discussed openly in Brazil. The trial was conducted under the Brazilian Criminal Code, with a judge, prosecutor, defense team, and limited public access. The hearings were held with limited access due to health restrictions imposed in response to the pandemic. Despite this, every day of the trial was covered in local news, and brief excerpts from the statements of lawyers and investigators were widely discussed on social media. The prosecution presented the court with extensive evidence gathered during the investigation. This included surveillance camera footage showing Kimberly and Rafael entering the building on May 10, and Rafael leaving alone 2.5 hours later. Expert reports were presented. His fingerprints found on the knife and other items in the apartment, biological traces, reconstructed messages confirming that Kimberly was afraid of this meeting, data from a phone found, reset, and discarded near the scene of the crime. The forensic psychiatric report attracted particular attention. Rafael underwent a full diagnostic evaluation as part of the investigation, and experts concluded that at the time of the incident, he was of sound mind, aware of his actions, and did not suffer from any mental disorders. He understood what he was doing and consciously tried to cover his tracks. This detail became key in the prosecutor's counterargument to the defense's claim of temporary loss of control. Rafael's lawyers tried to portray the crime as a tragedy committed in the heat of the moment, against a backdrop of emotional stress caused by a final breakup. They emphasized that the meeting was allegedly prearranged and that Rafael did not plan to cause harm. However, the court did not accept this line of defense, stating that the defendant's actions after the incident, deleting data, fleeing using fake documents, indicated an intention to avoid responsibility, rather than a sudden emotional breakdown. Several witnesses testified during the trial: Kimberly's friend, with whom she had been corresponding on the eve of the meeting, neighbors who heard the argument that night, and police officers involved in the investigation. The judge also heard from representatives of the Digital Forensics Lab, who confirmed that the messages and data retrieved from the phone had been properly restored and were authentic. In his closing statement, the prosecutor said, "This girl did not die by accident. She died at the hands of a man she once trusted. He robbed her of her future and then tried to rob her of her voice by destroying everything that could tell the story of her last hours." Rafael himself behaved reservedly in court, avoiding direct eye contact with the victim's family. When asked by the judge if he admitted his guilt, he replied evasively, "I didn't want this to happen. I didn't think," and fell silent. His defense insisted on his right not to give detailed testimony. On September 17, 2020, the Court of First Instance in Manaus found Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez guilty of intentional murder with aggravating circumstances. On September 21, 2020, he was sentenced to 29 years in a maximum security prison. Alison June Dickey was born on July 1, 1968, in Corinda, one of Brisbane's oldest and quietest suburbs. Her parents, both middle class, raised their daughter in an atmosphere of stability, attention to education, and respect for others. Her childhood was spent in a warm and structured environment. At school, Alison was a diligent student who actively participated in activities and clubs, especially choreography. Ballet became her personal passion from an early age. This art form accompanied her into adulthood. Her academic success, clear understanding of her goals, and balanced personality allowed Allison to enter university, where she studied subjects related to the humanities, psychology, and business organization. She later got a job at Flight Centre, one of Australia's leading travel networks, where she quickly established herself as a competent and responsible employee. Her colleagues recalled that Allison possessed a rare combination of tact, organization, and attentiveness, qualities that would later make her one of the division's leaders. It was at Flight Centre that Allison met Gerard Baden-Clay. He was several years younger and came from a family with a colonial history. Gerard was born in England in 1970, then moved with his family first to Africa and then to Australia. His family changed their surname to Baden-Clay to emphasize their connection to Lord Baden-Powell, the founder of the Scout movement. This connection gave Gerard a certain aura of respect in business and social circles. At first, his relationship with Allison was strictly professional. He worked in sales, was sociable, and knew how to make an impression. Over time, shared interests, working on joint projects, a sense of humor, and perhaps a desire for stability brought them closer together. They began dating and were married in August 1997. The wedding was modest but warm. To their friends and acquaintances, they seemed like a harmonious couple. After the wedding, the couple's life developed according to plan. Allison devoted herself to her family but eventually returned to work at Flight Centre, where she continued to climb the career ladder. Gerard changed careers and opened his own real estate franchise under a well-known brand. Their life resembled a classic Australian success story: 2 working parents, a country house, 3 children, family weekends, trips, and involvement in the local community. The house they moved to in Brookfield was rented but spacious and comfortable: 2 stories, a green yard, a children's play area, and a barbecue area. Allison devoted a lot of attention to her home and children. She participated in school events, took care of the logistics of family life, and monitored her daughter's progress. On weekdays, she would go to the office and return home in the evenings, where the usual chores awaited her. Gerard, as a business owner, often worked late but also participated in family life. From the outside, everything looked stable. Neighbors perceived them as a respectable couple. Allison was known for her friendliness, even-temperedness, and kindness. She was a good listener, remembered details, and was supportive, qualities that endeared her to colleagues and casual acquaintances alike. On April 20, 2012, according to Gerard, Allison got up around 5 a.m. The house was quiet. The children were still asleep. He claimed that she got dressed in sportswear and went for her morning walk, possibly a jog, as she allegedly did sometimes in the past. He stayed at home and lay in bed for a while longer. At 6 a.m., Gerard woke up completely. Allison was gone. At first, he thought she was late, but as the minutes passed, his anxiety began to grow. The morning progressed. The girls woke up. The day began, but Allison did not return. In the kitchen, there were cups left from the night before and some food taken out of the refrigerator as if for breakfast. There was no sign of haste or disorder. By 7 a.m., Gerard said he was seriously concerned. At 7:14 a.m., he dialed the emergency number and reported that his wife was missing. He specified that she had left early in the morning for a walk and had not returned. The dispatcher logged the call and dispatched a crew to the Brookfield area. From that moment on, the case was officially registered as a missing person. A little over 2 hours had passed since Allison was last seen leaving the house. The morning continued, and outside the windows everything was the same. Birds singing, cars driving by, everyday life. But in a house on one of the streets in Brookfield, everything was different. Gerard took the call from the police. He briefly described the situation, told them what his wife was wearing, and added that he had no idea where she might have gone. In the house, where everything had just been normal, there was now a growing sense of anxiety. After Gerard Baden-Clay's morning call to the police on April 20, 2012, a large-scale search operation began for the missing woman. Allison Baden-Clay, a 43-year-old mother of 3, had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. A week passed, then several more days, but there were no answers. And only 10 days later, on April 30, did the first concrete confirmation appear that the search was approaching a tragic conclusion. From the moment her disappearance was officially reported on the morning of April 20, local police began working on a standard procedure for such cases. They compiled a preliminary profile of Allison, describing her clothing, routes, and habits. Officers from the Indooroopilly police station were the first to arrive at the scene. The Brookfield area was known for its complex hilly terrain, numerous trails, ravines, and green areas. This created opportunities for secluded walks, but also significant difficulties for the search. Initially, police officers searched the surrounding streets, interviewed neighbors, identified potential witnesses, and checked surveillance camera footage. No calls had been made from Allison's cell phone since her disappearance. By the evening of the same day, the search began to take on an organized scale. From April 21, additional forces were brought in. A joint team of Queensland police officers, volunteers, and local residents was formed. Dog handlers were called in, and helicopters and drones were used. Information about Allison's disappearance was disseminated by local and national media. Flyers with Allison's photo and contact details were distributed in Brookfield and the surrounding areas. A hotline was set up for potential witnesses. The search continued daily. The area was divided into sectors. Police and volunteers combed through each of them: paths, walking routes, wooded areas, ravines, and stream banks. Particular attention was paid to the area along the Brisbane River and its tributaries, including Colo Creek, which would later play a key role. According to official representatives, a topographical map of the area and software that allowed them to model the routes Allison could have taken were used. Entrances to parks, parking lots, crossings, trails, and even recorded cell phone signals in neighboring areas were checked. At this time, Gerard Baden-Clay was at his home, interacting with the police and giving several comments to the press. He said he was concerned about his wife's disappearance and hoped she would return soon. At the same time, he coordinated the care of his daughters, who remained at home. Gerard participated in certain stages of the search, including distributing flyers, giving interviews, and appearing on morning news programs. His behavior was described by journalists as calm and reserved. When asked by a reporter, he replied that he was hoping for the best and believing that everything would turn out well. At the same time, attention to the case grew. Support groups appeared on social media, sharing photos of Allison, search plans, and coordinates for volunteers. People who were previously unfamiliar with the family joined the patrols and shared routes with each other. Cases of missing women in Australia have always attracted a lot of attention, especially when it comes to mothers of minor children. The operation continued from April 22 to 29. Every day, dozens of people took to the streets armed with maps, navigators, and instructions. The police asked local residents to check basements, garages, backyards, ponds, and ravines. Helicopters with thermal imaging cameras surveyed forest areas. The weather during those days was changeable. Sunny and cloudy periods alternated, with occasional precipitation, which complicated both the search and the collection of evidence. There were reports of possible evidence, but none of them were confirmed. Some passers-by claimed to have seen a woman resembling Allison, but camera footage either did not confirm this information or did not allow the woman to be clearly identified. On the morning of April 30, at around 11 o'clock a.m., a man canoeing down Colo Creek noticed something unusual on the shore. In the bushes not far from the water, in a place away from the footpaths, he saw a motionless figure lying on the ground. He immediately contacted the emergency services. 20 minutes later, the first police officers arrived and cordoned off the area. Forensic experts and crime scene investigators were called in. The area where the discovery was made was difficult to access, with dense bushes, steep banks, and unstable ground. The discovery was located away from well-traveled routes where few people would go without a purpose. It was established that it was approximately 13 kilometers from the Baden-Clay family home. The area was cordoned off, and an initial examination began. The body of a woman in sportswear was found on the shore. She appeared to be around 40 years old. The clothing matched Allison's description. According to preliminary data, the clothing was neatly arranged, not torn or stained. The body was not in the water but lay slightly above the tide line, partially hidden by grass. On the morning of May 1, 2012, police reported that the woman had been identified as Allison Baden Clay. The identification was made with the participation of relatives. The body was taken to the city forensic laboratory for examination. Forensic experts began their work immediately. The autopsy, which was performed within 24 hours, did not reveal a clear cause of death. However, important conclusions were drawn. Based on the condition of the tissues, the position of the body, and the absence of medical or natural factors, it was determined that death was not due to natural causes. At the same time, no specific signs of external influence that could be interpreted unambiguously were found. Forensic experts classified the death as suspicious. Samples were taken for DNA analysis, and microparticles found on clothing and skin were examined. Special attention was paid to the composition of the soil under the body and the structure of the vegetation. All these elements would later become part of a complex picture of evidence. From the moment of this discovery, a new stage began, the analytical stage. Now that they had the body and the location where it was found, investigators began the painstaking task of reconstructing the last hours of Allison's life. Routes, timeframes, contacts, physical evidence, everything became the subject of detailed analysis. So far, no official charges have been filed. Gerard remains a widower and father of 3 girls in his care. The police are not making any bold statements, keeping their distance from speculation, but the investigation is already moving towards finding answers to the main question: what happened to Allison on the morning of April 20, 2012? And how did she end up 13 kilometers from home? Immediately after Allison Baden Clay's body was discovered on April 30, 2012, the investigation entered a whole new phase. Now investigators had not only a missing person report, but also proof of death. This meant that every action, every word, every detail from the moment of her disappearance took on new meaning, and the investigators began to move from broad search efforts to painstaking analysis. First, the investigators went back to the very beginning, to April 20. Reconstructing the chronology of the morning's events became a priority. According to Gerard Baden Clay, Allison left for her morning walk at around 5 a.m. He reported this to the police at 7:14 a.m. However, several questions immediately arose regarding the time, route, and circumstances of her disappearance. The police had access to CCTV cameras installed on Brookfield Street and on roads adjacent to the house. Their number was limited, but even under these conditions, no camera recorded Allison leaving the house or walking along routes that could be logically linked to her morning walk. Next, information about her cell phone was checked. The device's last activity was recorded the night before. There were no GPS signals. This in itself was not proof, but it was one of the first pieces of evidence that did not fit the proposed version of events. The police began surveillance of Gerard. He remained at the family home, took care of the children, communicated with relatives, and gave comments to the press. Outwardly, he appeared calm, focused, and showed no signs of emotional distress. However, investigators had reason to pay closer attention. During the first official interrogation, a number of scratches were noted on Gerard's face and neck. He explained that he had cut himself while shaving. The officers noted this in their report but did not jump to conclusions. Later, according to the conclusion of a forensic medical expert, the wounds were uneven and heterogeneous in nature, not entirely typical of injuries caused by a razor blade. At the same time, the expert emphasized that final conclusions could only be made with additional information. The police also noted other minor observations, for example, fresh scratches on the chest and shoulders, which Gerard could not explain. All these details became part of the overall picture, but until a certain point, were considered secondary. In parallel with the physical evidence, the investigation began to examine the family's social connections and financial situation. A quick look at emails, cell phone calls, and bank transactions gave new info. It soon became known that Gerard Baden-Clay was in a relationship with one of his real estate agency employees. Their correspondence, including deleted messages, was partially recovered by technical experts. These letters discussed plans for the future, including the possibility of living together. Some messages were dated just a few weeks before Allison's disappearance. This information was not evidence in itself, but its significance grew in the context of other data. For example, an analysis of financial documents showed that Gerard's business was in dire straits. The agency had been operating at a loss for several months in a row. The family had significant debts, including bank loans and rental obligations. It was also established that Allison had a life insurance policy worth more than 800,000 Australian dollars. Gerard was listed as the primary beneficiary. Investigators considered this a potential motive, but again, they did not jump to conclusions. Everything was recorded and fed into an analytical model. The next step was to check the time frame during which Allison allegedly left. According to Gerard, he woke up around 7 a.m. and found that she was gone. However, the couple had not mentioned any plans to go jogging the night before. Moreover, according to the testimony of relatives, Allison had not been jogging regularly in the morning lately. The key moment was the time window between 10 p.m. on April 19 and 7:14 a.m. the next day, when Gerard reported her missing. At that time, apart from him and Allison, there were 3 children in the house. None of them heard any noise, the door slamming, or any other unusual sounds. At the same time, Gerard claimed that he did not hear his wife leave because he was asleep. Police began analyzing possible routes in and around the area. Information about his car's movements during those hours was incomplete, as his car did not have a GPS system. However, the police had data on his cell phone activity. This data showed that the device had not left the Brookfield area during the night, but in the early morning hours, the signal moved closer to the southwestern outskirts, in the direction of Colo Creek. This piece of information required further verification, but by May, investigators were already considering the possibility that Allison's body had been taken there in advance. By early June 2012, investigators had developed a preliminary timeline of possible events. The established facts: an extramarital affair, financial obligations, an insurance policy, no alibi at the critical time, and contradictory body movements, all formed a logical, albeit incomplete, picture. Gerard Baden-Clay had still not been formally charged. He continued to live his normal life, caring for his daughters and participating in family affairs. The police conducted surveillance and carried out background checks. Investigators continued to gather pieces of the puzzle, knowing that only their combination could form the basis for an indictment. On June 13, 2012, almost 2 months after Allison Baden-Clay's body was found near the banks of Colo Creek, investigators took a decisive step. That morning, Gerard Baden-Clay arrived at the Indooroopilly police station on a summons for further questioning. He had already cooperated with the investigation on numerous occasions, answering questions and providing information. However, this time the situation was different. In the office where the interview was taking place, one of the officers presented Gerard with an official notification. He was charged with committing a crime against his own wife and with interfering with the circumstances surrounding the handling of her body after her death. The procedure went smoothly. Gerard did not resist, stated that he understood the charges against him, and expressed his intention to exercise his right to defense. His lawyer was notified, and within a few hours he was in custody. The investigation that led to this day was multi-stage and methodical. It relied on various categories of evidence, both direct and circumstantial, gathered since Allison's disappearance. The police's attention was first drawn to injuries on Gerard's face and body, noticed in the first days after his wife's disappearance. He explained them as the result of an unsuccessful shave, but forensic analysis concluded that the nature of the injuries did not correspond to normal cuts. The scratches varied in depth, direction, and shape. There were also marks on his chest that could not have been caused by contact with clothing or household items. These findings were recorded in the reports and accompanied by photographs. At the same time, data on movements were analyzed. It was established that in the early morning hours of April 20, during the so-called window of uncertainty, Gerard's mobile device was located at a point southwest of Brookfield. According to experts, these coordinates indicated movement toward Colo Creek, although no direct GPS records were preserved. Later, when Allison's body was found in this very area, the comparison of data became an important element of the analysis. In addition, the investigation's attention was drawn to deleted messages from Gerard's phone, which were partially recovered using technical means. These messages contained discussions with a woman with whom he was in a personal relationship, including conversations about living together in the future. Some messages were dated just days before Allison's disappearance. At the same time, Allison, according to available information, was not aware of the extent of this relationship. A separate line of investigation concerned financial issues. The Baden-Clay family was experiencing significant difficulties. Gerard's previously successful business was in a loss-making phase, and loans and debts were mounting. At the same time, an insurance policy was discovered in Allison's name for more than 800,000 Australian dollars, with Gerard listed as the main beneficiary in the event of his wife's death. Taken together, this was seen as a possible motive. It is important to emphasize that at this stage the police did not make any public statements about motives. All information was used as internal information. The investigation also had access to a behavioral analysis conducted by forensic psychology experts. It included an assessment of Gerard's reaction in the first days after his wife's disappearance, an analysis of interviews and records of his interactions with law enforcement and the press. It was noted that his rhetoric avoided expressions related to personal memories, emotions, and feelings. However, in official materials, these assessments were considered an additional factor, not an independent basis. On June 22, 2012, a court hearing was held at which Gerard's lawyers filed a motion for temporary release on bail. They cited his status as a family man, lack of criminal history, and active cooperation with the investigation. Judge David Bodies denied the motion. The decision stated that there was a significant risk of flight given the seriousness of the charges, the possible motive, and the evidence presented. After the hearing, Gerard was transferred to a remand center where he remained awaiting trial. News of the arrest quickly spread across Australia. The case, which had already attracted widespread attention, now took on a new dimension. Public opinion was divided. Some believed the police had acted appropriately, pointing to contradictions in the testimony and the availability of digital and behavioral data. Others expressed caution, recalling the presumption of innocence and the need for an objective trial. Analysis, expert commentary, and interviews with lawyers began to appear on television and in the press. Particular attention was paid to the ethics of reporting, given the presence of minor children in the Baden-Clay family. Gerard, in turn, issued a statement through his lawyers proclaiming his innocence. He said he would defend himself with all legal means at his disposal. His defense team began preparing for the trial, the date of which was to be announced shortly. Thus, by mid-June 2012, it was finally clear that the investigation had completed its first phase and handed the case over to the courts. Gerard Baden-Clay was no longer seen as a witness to the tragedy. He officially became a defendant in a criminal case. The public awaited the next stage, the court proceedings, where the main question would be decided. Which of the evidence presented would be confirmed, which would be challenged, and what conclusion the court would ultimately reach. The trial of Gerard Baden-Clay began on June 10, 2014 at the Brisbane Supreme Court. By that time, more than 2 years had passed since Allison's disappearance. The prosecution, defense, jury, journalists, and the public were ready to hear anything that could shed light on the circumstances of this story, which had become iconic for the state of Queensland. The trial was presided over by Judge John. The trial attracted widespread media interest, and many of the hearings were packed not only with participants but also with observers, including representatives of community organizations dealing with family conflict issues. At the first hearing, the prosecution presented its case, Gerard Baden-Clay was, according to them, the only person who was with Allison in the house during the critical hours. He allegedly got into a fight with her, which could have been related to their personal life, financial problems, and the pressure of the situation. The prosecution's case was based on a combination of evidence: the nature of the physical injuries, inconsistencies in the alibi, the movement of the mobile phone, deleted messages, and the conclusions of behavioral experts. Particular attention was paid to the conclusions of the forensic experts who, although they did not establish the exact cause of death, ruled out the possibility of a natural outcome. The physical impossibility of Allison ending up in the Colo Creek area on her own was also emphasized. The defense insisted that the evidence was circumstantial and did not paint a clear picture. The lawyers put forward a theory of possible accidental death during a domestic dispute or accident without intent to cause harm. They emphasized that Allison had experienced emotional difficulties in the past and that her mental state could have influenced the course of events. In addition, the defense insisted that Gerard cooperated voluntarily with the police, did not hide, and did not obstruct the investigation. More than 70 witnesses were heard during the hearings. Among them were police officers, forensic doctors, digital data experts, colleagues, friends, and family members of both the accused and the deceased. Of particular significance was the testimony of mobile network experts who confirmed that Gerard's phone had been in the vicinity of the location where the body was found in the early hours of April 20. The court also heard call records, cell phone activity data, and recovered messages from the devices. Over the course of 5 weeks, the parties presented their arguments. The judge ensured order and strictly followed the procedure. The prosecution emphasized the causal link between the defendant's actions and Allison's death, while the defense argued that there was no direct evidence and suggested the possibility of a tragic accident. In early July 2014, the case was handed over to the jury. They had to make a decision based on the evidence presented and the judge's instructions. The jury was reminded that the prosecution had to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt and that any ambiguities should be interpreted in favor of the defendant. The deliberations lasted several days. After deliberations during which all the key episodes were discussed, the verdict was announced on July 15, 2014. On July 15, 2014, the Brisbane Supreme Court found Gerard Baden-Clay guilty of committing a crime that resulted in the death of his wife, Allison Baden-Clay. On July 18, 2014, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of applying for parole after 15 years.